gameplay experiences to how Ferris's background in film influenced the game's narrative. If you're interested in reading the full interview, you can do so at unrealengine.com/feed. Last year at Unreal Fest Seattle 2024, Epic Games shared the stage with wireless technology innovator Qualcomm to announce that we're expanding our partnership with a new HMI offering. For the first time ever, Unreal Engine will be directly deployed into Qualcomm Snapdragon automotive platforms, giving automakers that adopt Snapdragon digital chassis solutions exclusive access to pre-integrated and optimized Unreal Engine features. This is set to make it easier, more cost-effective, and more viable for automakers to bring next-generation digital cockpit experiences to their vehicles. To learn more about what the partnership entails, check out the feed. This month's free Unreal Engine learning content spans an array of topics, including tips and tricks on producing visual effects, customizing and animating metahumans, VR game development, and much more. From Epic staff, we have the following: creating stylized water ripples in Unreal Engine. Learn how to create stylized, hand-drawn looking water ripples for your projects. The idea is to create a simple material that's easy to change and animate, and that can be easily art-directed to match your aesthetic. NNE Neural Post-Processing. Neural post-processing involves applying artificial neural networks to modify a final rendered image after the main rendering process is complete, allowing for advanced visual effects and image manipulation using AI techniques. In this tutorial, you'll learn how to program C++ and Blueprint classes to enqueue a neural network to the render graph pipeline that applies neural post-processing to the final rendered images. How to get God rays with ray-traced shadows. Check out this quick and easy tip for achieving realistic, atmospheric God rays simply by adjusting a few settings in Unreal Engine. We've also got some great tutorials coming in from the community as well. An introduction to PCG tools in Unreal Engine. Explore Unreal Engine's procedural content generation tools in this beginner-friendly tutorial. You'll learn how to dynamically scatter assets across landscapes, apply advanced filtering techniques for precise placement, and utilize tags and splines to create immersive and optimized environments. Unlocking the potential of metahuman customization, a guide for Unreal Engine developers and artists. This guide explores metahuman customization in Unreal Engine, covering materials, textures, geometry, hair, and garments. It explains workflows like morph target editing, texture painting with Substance Painter, and garment creation using panel-based methods. Detailed tips on optimizing performance and enhancing realism will help you create unique characters tailored to your projects, blending technical and artistic approaches. Color Grading Panel in Unreal Engine 5.5. The Color Grading Panel centralizes scene color adjustments by managing actors with color grading tools like post-process volumes and color correction regions. It simplifies workflows by reducing the need to adjust individual actors' detail panels. This tutorial covers all essential aspects of this powerful tool. How to create realistic smoke and fog. Dive into the world of visual effects with our latest tutorial on creating realistic smoke and fog in Unreal Engine 5. Whether you're a beginner or an experienced developer, this step-by-step guide will help you master the art of atmospheric effects. Watch to learn tips and tricks that will enhance your projects and bring your scenes to life. And lastly, here's some epic talks and demos. Animating metahumans with the Game Animation Sample Project. Watch this recorded talk from Unreal Fest Seattle 2024 and learn how to animate metahumans with the Game Animation Sample Project. You'll learn how to import and manipulate character animations, switch characters dynamically, and create cinematic camera sequences. The video also covers the MetaHuman Mesh to MetaHuman workflow and much more. Using UE5 to build modern VR action games. Check out this recorded session from Unreal Fest Seattle 2024 and explore how Servios built an immersive tech stack for Alien Rogue Incursion using Unreal Engine 5. Learn how to effectively utilize and extend Unreal Engine's chaos physics, enhanced input, and gameplay ability system to elevate your VR game development. You can find the link to all of these tutorials on our feed or on the Epic developer community. Have you heard the latest on Fab? Wish lists are now live. There's new search filters and left navigation, as well as other various search improvements. You can check them all out on fab.com now. Interested in meeting some of your fellow developers? Here's a list of community meetups happening this month. Find one near you and enjoy. Let's get into this week's amazing community spotlights. Step into a world of color and warmth with Garden, a stunning stylized piece by Vincent Boishu. This artwork brings to life a cozy, beautifully detailed house surrounded by a flourishing garden, where every detail feels alive with charm and personality. Based on concept art by Zimmy, the piece captures a whimsical yet inviting atmosphere, drawing the viewer into a place that feels both familiar and dreamlike. With intricate details, rich textures, a perfect cat cameo, and a color palette that evokes comfort and nostalgia, this project feels like a celebration of home, nature, and the art of storytelling through design. You can check out more about this project on their ArtStation. Raw power, resilience, and incredible craftsmanship come together in this fan art of Grog, an intense, highly detailed sculpt by artist Greg Strangis. This striking but fun portrayal of Grog Strongjaw from Vox Machina is a testament to the skill and dedication poured into the piece that had been rediscovered in an old hard drive and polished up into what you see now. The realistic textures and meticulous attention to detail bring Grog to life in a way that feels almost tangible, capturing both his imposing strength and the chaotic nature of his character. A must-see for fans of Critical Role and digital sculpting alike. You can learn more about it on their ArtStation. A place of creation or something far more unsettling. John Doe Attic, an environment piece by John Carney, immersed us in an art studio that felt like a perfectly captured moment in time. The space is cluttered with half-finished paintings, splattered canvases, and discarded sketches, each hinting at a story untold. But there's something about the atmosphere that lingers, a sense of unease creeping into every corner. It teases the imagination. Is this a sanctuary of artistic obsession, or the remnants of something seemingly abandoned for a reason? The more you look, the more you feel the weight of the space, as if it's looking back. John Doe Attic is a masterful blend of beauty and quiet dread, inviting you to step closer, if you dare. Make sure to check out John's other work as well over on their ArtStation. That's it for today's news and community spotlights. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Inside Unreal, a weekly show where we learn, explore, and celebrate everything Unreal. I'm your host, Tina, and today with me I have two absolutely wonderful, lovely, amazing guests who some of you may have actually seen before, but today we'll be going over some gameplay-focused level design tips and tricks for y'all, just going over general concepts and all that kind of good stuff. We are going to be taking questions live, so if you have questions throughout, please make sure to toss them into chat there, and we'll kind of answer them as we go through. But we'll go through, introduce our guests, and then get right into it. There's a lot to cover today. So we'll start with you, Dan. Tell us who you are for those who may be unfamiliar.
Hi, my name is Dan Hutnick. I am the live stream operator here for Epic. So all the community streams that you see, I'm usually the one behind the scenes on the ones and twos making that happen. And I am also an environment artist I've been an environment artist for officially 10 years, but hobby probably another 10 before that. So yeah, we're here to talk about some fun environment some specifically level design tips from an environment artist perspective. So
Yeah, it's going to be great. And then Jessica, as well, for those who may not be familiar, tell us a little bit about yourself as well.
Yeah, hi, my name is Jessica Plowman. I am a technical writer and technical writing manager here at Epic on the Unreal Engine documentation. Prior to coming to Epic, I've been at Epic for 5 years. Prior to Epic, I was a teacher for 15 years, where I taught foundational Unreal Engine skills to high school students, college students, and level design has sort of always been my focus, both sort of in my teaching and outside my teaching. And now, as far as documentation, I focus on world building tools, PCG related stuff and art pipeline tools. So this is an exciting topic for me to talk about.
Yeah, it's going to be a good one. I'm really excited. So, Dan, I guess I'll just toss it your way to kick us off.
Yeah, I'll jump over there for a second. I am going to have to move to a separate computer, so Tina and Jessica are going to vamp for me for a moment. But we are already
Okay, you're
getting
right.
a biblically accurate me with the dual headsets.
With the two headsets.
I
We
gotta
can't
say,
address it.
when you hear yourself at about a second delay while you're talking, it is very hard to talk. So I
Oh, it's
apologize for any
odd.
sort of stammering that I was doing there for a second. Audio should sound good. Folks in the chat, if any audio issues, whatever, let us know. I'm gonna have a hard time monitoring while demoing, so I am going to take the one pair off, and we're gonna go ahead and jump in. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn off my camera for a second, and then we'll jump in.
We'll be back. We'll be doing the things.
It's not even like he's Dan anymore now that he's wearing only one set of headphones.
Yeah. So I guess while we're waiting for that to get set up, Jessica, I have a question for you to kind of
Yeah,
kick us off. Because today we're going to be talking specifically about gameplay focused level design. Because there's different kinds of level design. And I was wondering if you
definitely.
wouldn't mind just kind of going through what some of those key things would be for focusing on gameplay over other types of level design to consider.
So that's going to be like the interesting approach today. Dan with his environment artist perspective, and Tina, same with you, with your focus more on the art side of things. My background is more from the gameplay side. And really, when you are working from that perspective, is you work almost more in a gray box than you do with actual finished art. You
Mm,
don't want to let the fact that art may still be in production or the art style is not settled yet keep you from designing something and playtesting it. And we're going to talk about playtesting towards the end of our chat today. When you are talking about it from a gameplay perspective, you really have to think about it in terms of what is the level there to communicate to the player and what is the level there to support. And when I say that, I mean like, what are some narrative beats that happen in the level that I have to give space for a like an in-game movie or a cinematic to happen?
right.
What does my level have to teach the player? So like if my level is part tutorial, I have to create a parkour course that teaches how to do wall running because that will be important later. And then later on in the same level, you may have a part of the level that is literally designed to test the player's use of that move or anything like that. You see it in the beginning of a lot of games where the first section is sort of like an in-game tutorial. Games like Call of Duty do that a lot, where they run you through like a training simulation, but that's really there to
Hmm.
teach you what buttons to press and how to do the things. And then later on, each level is just a test of those skills that they taught you. So it's really a focus on you kind of need to know what you're going to do a little bit ahead of time, what your level is there to support, and what kind of like shape language and cues in the level are you going to use to communicate your intentions to the player.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
You don't care if it
absolutely.
looks pretty.
Yes,
Exactly. It has to
yes.
function.
Exactly.
And something we're going to actually emphasize quite a lot going through is that in the early stages of any design, you cannot be afraid to kill your babies. I know it's a terrible way of phrasing that, but it's just the way people say it. And that is that when you're getting in and you're gray boxing, you're really just throwing a lot of theory and like, I have this idea, I have this concept, I know this is kind of the vibe I want to go for, I know this is the direction I want to lean, and then you're putting it in, and that's its testing ground. Is this working? No.
100%.
Throw it out. That's okay. Or if it's like it's mostly there but it needs tweaking, then that's great too. But like if you'll be able to tell early on, like, is this doing what I wanted to? Am I getting the vibe or feel? If it's not, that's okay. That's why we're working in boxes. You took 5 minutes to test it, great. Do another 5, come up with something else.
And those
It's
boxes do have purpose.
100%.
The footprint of the gray boxes or white boxes, depending on what you call it, is going to be what your asset needs to fit in. So, you're going to take your gray box, you're going to export it, and you're going to give it to your artists, and they're going to make it pretty, and they're going to focus on those footprints that you put in there.
Yeah. Kill your darlings is actually the way you're supposed to say it. That was
I was going to say something, but I figured,
please do. That was
Dan's over here killing babies. Let's just let it ride.
So yeah, we'll go ahead and jump in. We have some slides here. There's a lot to cover, a lot to talk about, and we're going to try to get through it. We're almost assuredly not going to, because this is an incredibly deep topic, but we're going to try to get through as much of it as we possibly can. So yeah, this is just a basic little environment artist guide to level design. I'm specifically coming at it from the environment artist perspective, because I think we do have a lot of environment artists who join these streams and things like that. And whether you're an environment artist or not, understanding these principles is important. Or sorry, if you're a level designer or not, understanding these principles is important, because as an environment artist, you still have to lend to the level design. You have to make sure that whatever you're doing on the art phase or the art side is not taking away from the level design side. And actually, the best thing you can do is try to enhance that and add to it and reinforce that design. So again, even if you're not a level designer, you're just an artist, these are important things to learn, just because, again, it'll help you do your job better, or at least understand when you submit something and the level designers go, you can't do this, it blocked this line of sight and now the game's broken. You understand why, and so on and so forth. So yeah,
I actually have on my desktop, on my other computer, a 4-panel comic from the dev team Life Comic, that is an environment artist builds this beautiful scene, and then the last panel is a level designer comes in with 2 great big machetes like this and is just going to slice it all up.
Yep, absolutely. So yeah, just a little quick thing for me, just so that you know who is talking to at the moment. Yeah, I've been working on environments since really like the very late 90s, early 2000s. I did a lot of modding, Unreal, StarCraft, Halo, and then Far Cry when that came out. That actually had some integrated map editors and stuff like that. So played a lot of time in that. So I started actually with the level design side of it, because back then I was just like, hey, I'm playing games, I want to make some fun places or whatever. The actual environment art part of it came later as games got prettier, and I'm like, ooh, you can do some pretty cool stuff with the art side of it, and I kind of shifted there. But I've always had a love for the level design part of it, because even as an artist, a play space has to be fun before it's pretty. I can even say that. So we want to make sure that we're making sure that these play spaces are actually fun. And there's a lot of tips and tricks and general guidelines that you can follow to help do that. But realistically, the thing that's going to make it fun is play test it. Because if you play test it and it's not fun, then you can fix it. So as for that, there are exceptions to every rule. What we're going to be talking about here are general guidelines that we have found effective in our experiences. It's not one size fits all. It's not going to be uniform for everything. The needs of a platformer are going to be different for the needs of a first-person battle royale, that sort of thing. So make sure that you're keeping those sorts of things in mind, and know that just because we say, hey, this is a good idea, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a good idea in every instance, for every circumstance, so on and so forth. So when you are designing a level, you have to understand that the whole point of a play space is to make an area for the gameplay to happen, right? So you have to make sure that you're designing around those gameplay concepts and design principles. So when you're thinking about starting a map, you have to go, okay, so what am I designing for, right? Am I designing for a platformer? Am I designing for, first-person shooter? Is it single player, linear, open world, hub-based? Those sorts of things will really influence the kind of design that you'll need to do. Is it multiplayer? Is it, how many number of players are there? Is you doing like a 5v5? Are we doing a 32v32? Team-based, how many teams? 2 teams, 4 teams, 8 teams? Those sorts of things all help influence and kind of dictate the direction that you will take your designs, because each of them have different needs. If you just have 2 teams, then you really only need 2 bases or spawns or whatever. But if you have 8, 2 bases or spawns is not going to work, because people are going to be spawning together, and that's going to be very funny, but not so fun. At least not unless you're intending to be chaotic.
You also need to think about, in game design, we call it the three C's, right? Character, camera, and controls. What controls is the player going to have? And you have to make your level work with that. Camera is the big one when you're thinking about level design, because when you're building a indoor space for a first-person character and the camera is essentially the head of the character, you don't have to have as much headroom in there. You can almost use real-world measurements, because centimeters is what's used in Unreal, but of course you can go in the options and change that. If you're working in UEFN, the grid snapping and everything is set for you to Fortnite units. But if you are designing for a third-person character where the camera is above you, off to the right or the left, you have to kind of exaggerate those measurements a little bit to make sure that the camera fits through the door, to make sure the camera works on stairs correctly. So you kind of really need to know, and Dan's got the slide already.
Yes.
What you're using so you can accommodate those technical challenges.
And I would argue as important as knowing the game mode and the gameplay and that sort of general philosophy of design is, I would almost argue that the perspective you take is more important because it really dictates how you design a world. Third person is going to be much more focused on, like Jessica said, larger shapes, larger doorways, so your camera's not getting stuck on everything. I often use Gears of War as an example for this because their doors are hilarious. They are massive and they make no sense when you stand in them. You can stack like 2 Marcus Phoenixes on top of himself and he still doesn't reach the top of it. It's hilarious, but you don't notice unless you're looking for that kind of thing because it just feels good in the game. But you wouldn't design a first person world in that way. Or if you're using an isometric thing in a third person or first person game, you're going to focus on things like ceilings and stuff on the top. But in an isometric, none of that matters. You're just going to keep the camera up there. You have to handle how you deal with the tops of geometry and things like that, but it's a very different way of designing that world than it would be for other camera positions. So very important, something that you'll really want to keep in mind as you're designing. And then last one for this is just what genre are you designing for? There's a ton of genres, literally dozens, and there's countless permutations and combinations of them. Each of them have their own distinct design considerations, drafting out your levels. Knowing what you're designing for is paramount because you can just sit down and make a level and it'd probably be a good level, but if it doesn't fit for the needs of your project or your game, then you've made a bad level by that metric, right? So just keep these sorts of things in mind because they will directly influence the kinds of levels that you will make.
Being a level designer, you actually use things like shapes and whether or not something is claustrophobic or and things like that to actually communicate with the player. In a lot of cases, you're communicating emotions to the player, and you can do that in multiplayer as well as single player. The way you design hallways, for instance, is going to be very different in a horror style game because you're going to want to sort of create something that is claustrophobic, which increases the tension for the player, as opposed to something where maybe for a multiplayer game that's a little more fast paced, you're going to want something that's a little more wide open so the player can move and fight and that kind of thing. So really knowing what genre you're even designing for can help make sure that you're using geometry to create the right atmosphere.
Absolutely. And as we'll actually get in here a little bit in a couple of these upcoming slides, is even if you're just because the way you design levels or maps for single player varies from how you would design for multiplayer, but within single player there's also varies in terms of is it a linear game, is it an open world game, is it a stealth based horror game? Those sorts of things have extreme design considerations you have to be mindful of. But the same thing is also true of multiplayer maps. Like the way you design a Battlefield map is not at all how you design a Halo map, for example. So one of the things I want to do actually is just a fun little thought exercise is I want everyone here, and you can even put it into the chat if you want, to think of just some of your favorite maps. In this case, we're kind of talking multiplayer, but you could also, say like your favorite single player missions. And what I want you to do is I want you to kind of start deconstructing it, right? You can say like, oh man, I love that map. Great. You love it. That's awesome. Why? Why do you love it? Because for most people, they probably don't know. Really, they might be able to come up with a couple like points or whatever, but they probably don't really know why they love it. But understanding that why is going to give you a lot of the tools and principles for good level design, because you wouldn't like it if it wasn't good, right? So think about some of your favorite maps. What do you like about them? What do you dislike? Really break it down into like the finest details you can think of. Like even just like, oh, I thought the lighting on this part of the map was really cool or whatever. Do you have a favorite spot on the map? Do you have a favorite path? Like when you're playing it, you're like, I'm always going to take the left side or whatever. Do you have a favorite spawn where it's like, oh, if we play on this map, I'm hoping on blue team because blue team has the best spawn. What are some of your favorite moments that have happened on them? How did they unfold? What were some of your best plays? How did you make them happen? What did you have to do in the map to have the play unfold that way? What are some of the pain points? Even like your favorite maps, you might be like, oh man, I love this map, but if I spawn here, I hate it. Or this part of the map I never go to because nothing ever happens, or things like that.
So here's a question for you, Dan.
Yeah, go ahead.
Answer that question yourself. What is the level that made you love level design, and why?
Oh my gosh, that's hard.
I'll give you a moment to think if you want, because I can answer that question.
Give me a second, because there's a few. Yeah, go ahead.
So for me, it was I'm an older gamer. I'm not going to put a number on it, but I'm an older gamer. Original Half-Life. The level when you are escaping from the inside of Black Mesa to the outside in the subway tunnels, and you run into the Marines, because it creates the perfect you're being chased kind of vibe. The tunnels are smaller. There's kind of more claustrophobic cover in there. You have the yelling of the Marines as they communicate to each other. They didn't really at that time. That wasn't until like Fear. A few years later. Man, that was a great AI. But it gave you the feeling of, okay, I have limited ammo. These are professional soldiers that are going after me. I can't dodge them. I can't run away from them. There's no room in the space. I have to fight smart and go through them. That, even now, is my favorite level.
Yeah. So it's interesting, because if the question is what level made me like inspired me to want to make levels and become a level artist or whatever, I would argue it maybe not even be the best, but the one that did it was the mission Halo in Halo, where you start on the Pillar of Autumn. It's corridor shooter like you've played a million times up into that year. Pretty much any shooter from like the late 90s to early 2000s was just corridor shooters, things like that. So you start that game, you're like, yep, this is pretty par for the course. These aliens are fun. I'm having a good time. And then you land on the ring and it just opens and they just say, okay, go. And you're like, okay, I'll do that. And it was that, like, realizing like that wonder that just simply it will. And this goes back to shape language. This is a really good example of that, where you would set a tempo with this kind of claustrophobic thing, and then the only thing that they did is expand the space. And that made me go, I gotta explore this place. I gotta run around. I gotta see what this is all about. This is amazing. And that, I mean, obviously there's more to it than that. There's a narrative justification, the color palette changes, blah, 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 blah. But that simple act of expanding the world was the key point. And that's just level design. That's just shape language.
That is an excellent use of positive versus negative space, right?
Yes.
When you're in the corridor, you have lots of this positive space that is funneling you towards something, funneling you towards a result. And then you're put into this big negative space that's just wide open. There's not a lot of cover, but it immediately makes you think, oh my God, I don't know where to go. I need to explore this space because I don't have it mapped out in my head. And because it's so wide open, I can't see the edges of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is honestly, it's one of the first things I did when I just started, making levels. Is I was trying to figure out, like, how do I make good levels? Because my first ones were horrible. They were terrible. They were boxes. There was nothing interesting in them. And it was actually interesting early on because I would get very frustrated. I'm like, man, I just can't design anything. Like, what am I doing wrong? And at the time, there were things, like a little bit of literature and things like that. But the internet was much, much different from what it is now. There wasn't just like I could go online and find anything I wanted at that point. So a lot of it just came down to be like, okay, well, I'm just going to reverse engineer my favorite stuff. And you'd be surprised how many lessons you can learn from that, just from simply deconstructing what you like and why you like it, but also what you don't like too. Think about some of your least favorite maps. If you're like, because everybody's played a game where just like, they're like, oh, I'm gonna jump into a multiplayer map. Please don't give me this one. Give me any other map but this one. Think about that map. Why don't you like it? What are the aspects about its design that don't work? Is it that it's just not conducive for the gameplay, bad spawns, it's bland, there's not really a lot to do in it, it's easily like you can be like chokehold and you're stuck in the spawn and you can't do anything, or like if somebody gets this power weapon, then it's just over, that sort of thing. Those lessons are just as important as what you like, because then they tell you what not to do when you're making your own levels.
What's your example of that?
Of a terrible map?
Mm-hmm.
And you're just throwing me under the bus right now.
It's what I do.
I feel like it would have to be one of the Call of Duty maps. There was one in 4. I can't remember the name of it. I'd have to look it up to see what it was. It's been a while, but there was one in 4 that was like, I loved so many Call of Duty 4 maps, but there was one specifically in 4 that was just like super lopsided. One team had the high ground versus the other team, and if they keep spawning there, you're just done. It was strangely small for how many people on the map there was, and you could just be spawn trapped pretty bad in there. I would have to bring up a list. It's been I don't want to talk about how long it's been.
And we'll talk about balance later in the deck. For me, to give a modern example. Been playing a lot of Helldivers too lately, and I know there's probably some folks in chat who really enjoy Helldivers, and the design for Helldivers maps are very open. And I like that because it gives you a lot of opportunities to make decisions about how you want to play and how you want to approach the objectives in the level. But for me, swamp maps are my bane because there are so many trees. And we talk about this, the term for this is called occlusion. So many of your sight lines are occluded, and no matter what enemies you're playing, whether it's the bugs or the bots or the squids, you are going to run into a situation where they can sneak up on you. And I absolutely loathe that. And I will bomb trees down so that I don't have to deal with it. I will not go to a planet so I don't have to deal with it.
It's funny that you mentioned that, though, because like I think that can be a fairly consistent criticism. Like I remember, even though I thought it was stunning, absolutely stunning in the recent Star Wars Battlefront remakes, the tree maps were terrible because there's just so much foliage and you're getting shot from every single direction and you can't see where everybody are and everything like that. Even though it's stunning and I would look at it forever and find it very gorgeous, I don't think it was very fun to play on. And that really is mostly just comes down to kind of really cluttered occlusion and really poor sight lines, which we will also talk about here in a little bit.
Chat, don't make those maps. Don't do it.
Yeah, or make a good one and prove us wrong.
There you go. Better sight lines, less trees.
yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to go through a couple core tenets for solid level design here in the next slide. But before we do, we need to kind of step back and look at something a little more holistically, and that is the idea of fun, right? How do we make a fun map, right? To know how to make a fun map, you have to know what makes something fun. You may have heard this quote before. It's pretty common, and I personally think it's largely true, and that is that games are a series of interesting decisions, right? That's true. There's more to it than that, but that is a true statement. I would argue that games are a series of interesting decisions, a series of interesting actions, interactions, and reactions, a series of meaningful consequences, and a series of events that the player feels they have agency over. And I really want to emphasize feels, because in many cases they will, right? Especially in like a multiplayer kind of scenario. It's pretty much just player agency in a multiplayer scenario. In a single player scenario, there are decided outcomes, right? But the player should feel like they have the ability to impact that world, even if they ultimately don't really, outside of the fact that they could choose to shoot somebody or not, right? You want them to feel like they have agency in the game. And above all else, with all of them, they must yield interesting outcomes, right? It must have some sort of result that once you make your decision, once you have you take your action, once you whatever, that yields something interesting, rewarding, consequential, could be good or bad, like jumping off a bridge. Bad for your health, interesting if the ragdoll is funny, right? So
Great as an experience.
yeah, exactly. So that's kind of the core, four things for me. There's more nuance to it than that, but that's like the general idea of what games are and why they're fun. So
I learned it as games communicate an experience, which I feel like that sort of fits all of the things you have up there on the slide.
Yeah.
But it also, I believe the game communicates feelings that you want the player to feel. This is especially true for narrative and types of things, whether it's multiplayer or single player narrative. But I feel like it leans more towards the single player side. It communicates those feelings. If you want to make the player laugh, make them ragdoll down a chute.
Yeah.
People love that. You want the player to feel anger, rage, make the enemies do something absolutely terrible, and then you get to defeat them for that. You want the player to feel like they were included as part of something. I've been watching a lot of people play Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 lately, and that game does a great job of having meaningful narratives and meaningful stories where the people involved in those stories act differently after you make a decision. So again, it like communicates the experience of having been through that subquest or having slid down a chute head first with your legs flying over your head. Very well.
Yeah. And this is one of the reasons why I'm really glad that Jessica's here, is because I kind of structured this a little bit more around like the multiplayer centric design for a couple reasons. One, a lot of this is universal. A lot of the concepts that you would do for a single player game apply for a multiplayer game, blah, blah, blah. But also that single player gets really complicated really quickly. And I wanted to try to keep this kind of foundational if we can. Absolutely love that she's here though to provide that single player input, and because it's important, and that would be a great tenet to add on there, is to make sure that you're handling that emotional side too. Absolutely, it's a great point. Cool. So if I don't know, it looks like you were going to say something, Jessica. Are you good?
No. Okay, let's go.
All right, let's jump into it. Cool. So these are, again, my core tenets for solid level design, TM, as the arbiter of all that is true and objective. These are just the core tenets that I believe make for solid level design. Players feel that the level is fun to navigate. If you have a world where nothing's happening, we'll use the multiplayer example again, where you jump into a multiplayer game on your own. Is the level fun to just run around? If it is, that's a good level, because all that's going to do is enhance the gameplay that you put on top of it. If it's boring and you're just like, nothing's happening here, everything's flat, everything's the same, there's no interesting decisions to make, it's not going to be fun to navigate. Not a great start, or not a great aspect to your level if that's how a player feels. Players feel that the level is intuitive to navigate. These kind of go hand in hand, but more so, they just kind of hit the ground running, right? And they just go, and they feel like they can find their way around, or they know where they want to go and they know how to get there just intuitively. If they're stopping constantly and going like, where the hell am I? Where am I supposed to go? Where does this, blah, blah, that's not great, because then they're going to be spending all their time questioning the map instead of just living in it, enjoying it, and experiencing the game.
And actually, for teaching yourself how to create intuitive navigation, cities are an excellent example of that. How we approach mentally mapping our way through a new town or new city that we've moved to is exactly the same, and the same skills that we bring to a virtual space and how we map that as well. Landmarks are a great way to sort of do that. If I know one path from landmark A to landmark B, I can then connect those areas in my head and start to map out from there and find different ways to connect to that. And we'll talk about how many paths you should have between locations later on. But think about the way that you approach learning a new space, going to a new store, going to a carnival, that you've never been to and never seen that space laid out before. You use those same skills in virtual spaces.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. With that, players feel that the level piques their curiosity and invites exploration. So when they spawn in or load in or whatever, they look around and they go, oh, kind of like how I was with opening up that Halo mission the first time. I'm like, this is amazing. I want to go everywhere and see everything and look at every, nook and cranny. That feeling is huge because, again, you don't even really need any other game design inherently for a short period of time if they feel like just the simple map itself is worth exploring and looking at and interesting, and they want to uncover its secrets and pathways and whatever. This is definitely true if you're doing like a single player thing and you have like alternate paths that lead to like resource caches or collectibles or whatever.
I personally love games, absolutely love games and levels that reward exploration.
Absolutely.
I have this sort of almost OCD-like behavior where, especially in RPGs, I need to search every bit of every dungeon and every bit of the map because, one, I'm often rewarded for doing so, and two, the designers took the time to build it, so I should probably go find it so I can experience it.
Yeah. And it's
That's
funny
just
because
gotten worse as I joined the game industry.
yeah. And it's funny too, because for some players, it doesn't even have to be like an interesting reward. Just the simple act of like uncovering it is enough for me. Like, I don't know, this could be kind of a critical thing, so I'm not going to name the game, but I was recently playing a recently released RPG game that has a lot of exploration and a lot of nooks and crannies that you can go and find stuff in. And I am going over that game with like a fine-tooth comb. I've not found a single thing that was worth getting, but just the simple act of exploration and discovery is interesting enough for me that I still do it, because they've set up the world in a way that it is interesting to explore, even if maybe the reward table isn't all that.
That's a travesty.
Yeah.
Now that does segue really well into something that I talk about. I believe we link to it in the description for this video. I have an ongoing tutorial series on the Unreal Dev site where I am adding all of this information. Plus, it's a 12-part, and I'm only halfway through. But one of the last things I talked about was something called player economy, and that is that the player has time, skill, and a few other resources that they bring to the game, and they spend that to do the things in your game. So, if I'm spending my time, and as an adult, and this will be all the adult gamers here in chat, you have a very limited amount of time to spend in games every day. Maybe you have kids, maybe you have classes, maybe you have 2 jobs, and you need to spend your time wisely. You want a game that rewards you for the time that is spent. And like Dan said, maybe that reward isn't always material in the game. It doesn't have to be resources like money or mana or ammo for your gun. It can be something as simple as like a message sitting in the level that furthers the story, or, and these are my personal favorite, a vista that you walk up to. You go up a
Yes.
hill and you come over, and there's this beautiful shot of a landmark with like the sun setting behind it. That in and of itself can be its own reward.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's one that I think Bethesda historically has been really great with,
Oh
where they'll
yeah.
have just environmental storytelling. Like, yeah, there could be a cool reward down there, whatever. But you might just go down and just see the outcome of some event. And then you're just kind of like Sherlock Holmesing, like, oh, that corpse is over there and it's got a dagger in it. And that person's got an arrow at the door, whatever. And you're able to just kind of like deconstruct these stories that are just all done through the environment. Great rewards.
And you can do that both as a level designer and an
Absolutely.
environment artist. You
Yep.
really should tell stories in your spaces and make them feel alive.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. Cool. Next one is that players feel like there is a dynamic balance between risk and reward. Risk and reward is huge, especially in a multiplayer environment, because that's kind of where that tension comes from, right? It's just like, okay, cool, we got an enemy. He's locked down in that building. I could probably meander up on this left path and try to take, through that upper flank, but I don't know if he's got a teammate up there. That's a risk. The reward would be flanking the guy, those sorts of things. Giving the players opportunities through the level design to have those risk and reward vectors is huge. And usually that just comes down to like different opportunities to tackle a location or a building or an area or an objective or things like that. Having options for how they can do that, where they can go like, hey, I'm going to go straight to the front door, guns blazing, or I'm going to meander around the right side, try to get a flank, hope, that sort of thing. Players feel the consequences of their decisions. This one is huge. If you, try to make a jump and you don't make it, you have a consequence for that. Or if you're like, you know what, I don't even care, I'm just going to rush in to the enemy spawn and try to capture their flag and whatever. Making sure that those sorts of consequences are inherent, obviously in the gameplay, but also in the design of the level is huge.
But not our and consequences can go too far. You don't always want your for example, you don't always want your death sequence when the player needs to respawn to be 5 minutes long. Please don't do that.
I don't know why when you say that, I immediately go to, there's one, like Dead Space has some pretty great death sequences, and most of them are usually pretty quick, but there's one that's
and you can
just
also
like
skip them.
90 seconds long for no reason, and you're just like, why?
Is that the one where the monster rips your head off and then puts its own head
but
on
it
your
takes
body and walks away?
forever. Yeah. This is again a very big one, especially in multiplayer, but also true in single player things, and that is that there is no single path that yields victory. So if you're playing on a multiplayer map and you're like, man, the only way to win is to go to the left side, that's not great.
That's
because
awful.
Half of your map, or if you have a 3-lane map, 2/3 of your map just aren't really going to be used, and that's not good. Similar sort of thing. Oh, sorry.
I was just gonna agree with that. No single path and no single tactic are very important, because not everyone plays the game the same way. To say a positive thing about Helldivers, Helldivers maps and arsenal of things, especially if you buy the war bonds, give you a lot of different paths to victory and give you a lot of different opportunities to support the way that you play. As a designer, the more ways that you can support how people play, the better. One of the things I did a couple of years ago was I took a class from his name is Max Pears. He was one of the level designers on Cyberpunk 2077. And he actually showed us some of the designs from the game where their approach was, if the player is combat oriented, here's the way you can get through the level. If the player was stealth oriented, here's how you can get through the level. And if the player was tech oriented, like you're using quick hacks, you're opening doors, here's how you can do the level as well. So they always approached each section of the story with those 3 approaches in mind.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I'm also reading through my my speaker notes. I should be apparently reading these a little bit more, because I reading this, I'm like, wow, that explained that way better than that previous one that I just did. But yeah, so like dovetailing off of that, no single tactic to win the engagement. So if you feel like, hey, on this map, the only way to win is to run a high rate of fire SMG and camp in a building.
Mm-hmm.
That's not great. Now, some of that comes down to the game design, right? If the game design's like, hey, we got this really powerful gun, that can be part of it. But really, your level designs need to know the gun, right? And you need to build around that. If it's like, hey, you have this really high rate of fire SMG that works really great in close quarters, and this map is nothing but close quarters.
And here's an excellent example of your slide number 2, right? Not every rule applies all of the time.
Right. Exactly.
If in a single player experience, you just gave that high rate of fire SMG as a reward, and that was a milestone in the game, like this is your grandfather's SMG that he used to be the hero of our town ages ago.
Yes.
You want to then have the player use that, and you could force them to use that by creating almost like a favela type environment that's very claustrophobic in close quarters.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's an absolutely great point. Yeah. And then again, this kind of goes back to exactly like we also said early on, which is understand the mode, right? If it is a single player thing where like the whole point is that you're supposed to feel really dang powerful, then yeah, give them a SMG, put them in close quarters and just let them, rip crap up. That's not so much fun in a multiplayer environment where everybody's supposed to have equal footing and you feel like you don't in that sort of thing. So
exactly.
Again, knowing what you're designing for is huge.
Another great example of that, not to bog us down a little bit, but I think this is a great example of it. Far Cry, I think it was 3, introduces the flamethrower at a certain milestone in the game, and then your immediate next mission is centered on the flamethrower.
Yes.
And burning down fields of stuff.
Specific stuff.
Yes.
Yes.
If you haven't played that, it is one of the better Far Cry games, and I highly recommend it almost specifically for that sequence.
Great soundtrack for that event.
Yes, great soundtrack.
Yeah, absolutely. And the last one here is that the players feel like they are empowered to create their own fate. That's kind of just a long way of saying like players have agency, right? And they feel that they have agency. So again, if we're using a multiplayer example for here, it's not like, oh, I spawned on this map and I spawned on B team side, which is terrible, and I'm just going to get spawn killed here.
Mm-hmm.
There's no agency there. They feel like they've lost their agency and they're just stuck to the whims of the level. Not great. You want to make sure that your level feels like, okay, even though I'm in a maybe disadvantageous position, I have a method to escape from this or flip the table around and turn it on, the opponent or whatever. Making sure that your level design allows for actions like that is huge.
For single player games, that would be creating like a boss arena that only supports one way to beat the boss.
Yes.
And yeah, that only supports one way to beat the boss.
Dark Souls 3.
That is my brain immediately went to Souls-like or roguelike style games that if you get a certain boss or room, you only have one option, and it's only to slog through it by trying to kill the thing 300 plus times.
Yeah.
Don't ask me how I know.
Yeah. Love Dark Souls 3, by the way. That wasn't a complete shade, but there is one boss design where it's just like, you pretty much have to use this weapon and no others, and that's never fun.
I hate that.
Cool. Yeah. So we're going to do a quick little, just break a level down into its core elements, right? This pretty much just comes down to 2 points here. And that levels are essentially points of interest, narrative stages, engagement zones, choke points, navigation challenges, power positions, and flanking routes. All are connected through traversal spaces that glide the player movement and the flow of combat. Within those, you can use verticality, sight lines, and cover to shape engagements, while risk-reward, dynamic and traversal options create depth, encourage players to adapt and strategize as they play. I was going to cut to a top-down map here, according to the show notes, but I think I'm going to wait. I think I'm going to hold off on that for just.
That sounds incredibly great. The example, but your answer also sounds incredibly academic. I loved it.
It is probably the most phrased like that thing I have on this slide.
I would add to that too. One of the core elements is it is a collection of decision points.
Mm.
You get, whether you're making multiplayer or single player, you get to a certain point and you have to decide whether to go left or to go right,
Yeah,
whether to go up or go down, whether to
that's a
flank
great
your
addition.
opponent, as we've used as an example several times, or stealth. And you can represent that in a lot of different ways, but like, for instance, making a list of the decisions that you have to make in the level before you get started is a great way to sort of approach that. Interesting decisions.
Comes back to this. Comes back to that. Yeah, I love that. That's a great addition. Cool. So covered a lot of theory. We're gonna quickly. I'm gonna actually try to speed run through a little bit of this because there is stuff in engine that I want to get have time to get to, and we do have, unfortunately, a hard out for today. So we're gonna jump in just real quick. So where do you start? Anyone who's worked in creative capacity has dealt with roadblocks before, writer's block, that sort of thing. Staring at an empty page, or in this case, an empty map, can be a hard hurdle to overcome. What's more is what works for one person won't necessarily work for another. So part of this really is kind of figuring out what works for you and the way your brain works. It would also depend on the needs of the project and the needs of the design you must cater to. From a personal perspective, I almost always work from some sort of starting position and then expand outward from there. So it'll depend, it'll vary from project to project depending on edict or the needs of the project. So if like I'm working and my boss comes to me and says, hey, we need a map that does this game mode really well with this number of players and it's set in this environment, then I know that that's where I have to start from, and I have to pick a point there to extrapolate off of. Or in some cases, I'm just making a map and I know like I want to make one-sided CTF, whatever, blah blah blah. Start from there. But for example, I should actually click on the slide. You can start from pretty much any solidified point that inspires you, right? So it could be the needs of the game mode, the objective, the player count. It could be the size of the map, small, medium, large. It could be the map style or theme. So maybe you hey, this one's going to be set on like an ice planet, or this is going to be set like on a beach, or this is going to be set in a bunker in World War II. That sort of starting point can be a little bit of inspiration for you to go like, oh yeah, cool. And then I want to do blah, blah, blah. Preference of play style. Is it close quarters? Is it vehicle heavy? Or is there a specific narrative or gameplay beat that you want to touch on? This is actually a great thing that Jessica has kept, pointing to. If the gameplay beat is like, all right, in this part of the level or in this level, you get the gravity gun. We'll use Half-Life, right? Or whatever. Then we want to make sure that what we're designing from there enhances the gravity gun. And you could be like, okay, cool. Well, the gravity gun lets me move boxes, and I could make a really cool thing where I have to stack boxes to get up there. Your starting point for the level could be just that, starting at that gameplay mechanic and then extrapolating from there.
And if you remember in Half-Life 2, they did a whole level purely based on the gravity gun right after you got it.
Yep, absolutely. And if you have none of the above and you're just wanting to work on a game, on a map you want to practice, or you're making something for your own, sake, hobby, whatever, and you don't have any of these things, you don't really have a reference point that you want to, that you don't, a concept that you're going off of, a theme or whatever like that, you can also just jump in and start throwing some boxes around and see what sticks, what inspires you. For me, more often than not, when I'm given a direction, I have some inkling that pops into my head, like whatever that kind of first instinct is. Some people will use the thing where it's like, hey, if you don't know where you want to go for food, pick two, flip a coin, and whatever you feel when the coin is in the air, that's what you want to do. You can have a similar thing like that, where you're like, oh, I want to make a map, but I don't really know, or whatever. But you can, that little starting point could just exist, or it could be inspired by like a theme or a game mode or whatever like that. I'll pick that sort of thing, and then I'll just kind of jump in and start working. And we'll show a little bit of that once we get into the engine. But a lot of times I will have like a snapshot of something in my head, like some sort of play space or a point of interest or a thing that I want the player to be able to do on that map. And I'll have that little snapshot and I'll be like, cool, I'm taking that, I'm holding on to it. We're going to go in, I'm going to build that part and then see where it goes. How do I add on it? Okay, this part is cool. I like it, but what connects to it? Okay, that works. Okay, cool. What connects to that? Well, and then just kind of building it out from there. Kind of like starting on a puzzle, right? You start from a piece and you just kind of build it out as you go.
For me, from the single player perspective, I often use where the player is supposed to be at the end of the level and design backwards from that.
Yeah.
You know, if at the end of the level, the player is supposed to be a wall running master. You know, the beginning of the level where they introduce the mechanic is going to have very sort of easy jumps to get you started with very low stakes, right? You run, you're trying to get to a power up, you wall jump off a wall and then run across it to get to it. If you fall, you don't even fall enough distance to take damage. But towards the end, the middle and the end, the stakes have to be higher to push the player to really learn the mechanic because it's going to be important later or whatever reason. So it's possible that to get to the end of the level, to see a great vista or hit a particular narrative point or something like that, you need to run to a certain point, pull off like a wall jump, wall run combo. What is it? The first of the new Jedi games did that really, really well.
Yeah.
Jedi Fallen Order, great game if you haven't played it.
Yes.
On the planet that they introduced wall running, to leave the planet and finish the objective, you have to be able to wall run. If you can't, you won't be able to clear the level.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Great point. Cool. Next one. Let's get through this. So if I could only give one piece of advice throughout this whole stream, it would come. So Tina, I may have actually already preempted you on this one. I just realized that when I said it.
I can't believe it.
I didn't mean to. I didn't actually intend on that. That was totally happenstance. It would be to embrace the blockout. And the reason I say this is that some people love blockout stage. They absolutely love it. They get in, they revel,
I do.
Me too, a bit. I do love like the other parts too, but I also really love the blockout stage. I didn't always, to be honest with you, but I've learned to love it, and now I revel in it. And I
get to be the opposite because I don't like the blockout stage. I'm sorry.
And that's totally fine. You don't have to love it, but you need to embrace it. And the reason that is because everything sounds great in theory, right? But they don't always work in execution. And the blockout is quite literally the foundation that everything else is going to stand on. Your gameplay, your narrative, your art, your lighting, your characters, everything else that exists in the game has to live on a level. And if you haven't nailed that, then you just have a not great level. And what gets really unfortunate, and I've seen this happen, and unfortunately I've done it too, is you go like, all right, I'm getting to the blockout phase. This is mostly there. We'll fix it as we go. And then art gets in there and they make a bunch of art. And then we get into play test and everyone's like, this is terrible. Why is this here? We need to remove this whole half the map. All that,
and that's wasted money.
Yeah, is done now. You have to undo all of that work. So it is so key to get in there, play around, try something, and ideate the absolute living hell out of it. Get in there, try it. Is it working? Awesome, cool. Let's keep going. Is it not working? Okay, no. Is it not working at all? Should I get rid of it? Is it not working because the shape language is a little off, or the scale isn't quite there, or maybe the position of the hallway needs to be go over a little bit, or maybe that door needs to be shifted, or that sort of thing? Then make that change. But do it in the blockout stage, and do it with blockouts. Boxes. We don't need handles on the doors at that point. Just cut a hole in the wall. That's a doorway. Great. Move on. Once you're done, you've play tested the heck out of it, you're very content with it, and you're very happy with it, then by all means, move on, art the hell out of it, and have a great time. But do not neglect the blockout stage, because you would be amazed how much better your maps will be if you just give it a little bit more attention.
From the business perspective as well, this part of it is very low risk. You're only spending time. Time is money, of course, but you're not spending a lot of time. You just need to be able to throw out, as we spoke of earlier, kill your darlings if you, in playtest, find out something doesn't work, meaning that if you don't playtest, you won't find out that works. And then you have the situation Dan was talking about earlier, as well as this allows you to really begin working on a level and really getting it fleshed out without even thinking about art yet. There's a lot of the idea among students, for instance, that you have to have some kind of art first before you can get started building anything. And that is just not true. And you're doing yourself a disservice if you think that the art needs to be even started before you start working on something. I would argue that you shouldn't even start the art until you have your blockout polished and solid.
Absolutely. 100%. And the other thing that
Sorry, Tina.
And the other thing that I want to stress with the blockout stage is that it's at least very early in it, you don't have to be meticulous, right? Just build stuff out, be quick. Think of them as sketches. Like, I am quickly sketching this thing out. Here is a ramp, or what will eventually be a really great staircase. All right, a ramp. Great, perfect. Here is a room that's eventually going to be an awesome coffee shop. Cool, it's a box. We're moving on. Like, get that part done first. Blockout should not take you terribly long. I would say that if you're spending, okay, take this with a grain of salt. It's really going to depend on the project and the needs or whatever. But if you're taking more than like 5 days, like on the high end for a blockout, you're probably being a little bit too meticulous. We're going to go to the editor here very soon, I promise. And I'm going to show you something. I did this over the course of a weekend where I was also living my life, right? So maybe 8-10 hours tops for everything that I'm going to show you here. And I got quite a lot done. Not perfect. And I kind of left it not perfect on purpose because I want feedback and critique and I want you to see what's not working. But I got a lot done in that time because I wasn't being crazy meticulous, like trying to adjust little vertices like by pixels or whatever, or making sure this is exactly 31 centimeters or anything like that. I was just dealing with shapes, getting the language in there, getting the scale in there, getting the proportions in there, making sure that it was fun to navigate, making sure that I wasn't having any issues with line of sight or anything like that, and then moving on.
And don't be afraid to just use arrows and text renders in your blockouts to say, okay, this is going to be a parkour section. You go this way. Put some arrows on the wall. Boom, done. You don't have to completely block it all in.
Absolutely.
You want people to know this is a cafe where you meet a character. You can literally put text that says, meet Hubert, has convo. Done. You don't even have to have the systems in there for that yet.
Absolutely. Yep, exactly. Because it's just blockout. It's just sketches. It's just making sure that things are where they're supposed to be and that it feels good. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's in a completely finished, polished state at that point. Map flow and player guidance. These are just some general things that you'll want to understand. Map flow is just how the map flows. How do players navigate and move throughout this map? Linear is pretty simple. They're going to kind of go in a straight line. In linear, though, you can have branching paths and they can follow through that. But it's really important in multiplayer maps because if for you physics folks out there, if there's nothing interesting to do and nothing happens, you have entropy and people just stand still and they don't do anything. So you want players moving around the map. You want them going from point A to point B to point C for whatever reason, for objectives, to kill the enemy that's over there, to get a power weapon, to get a power up, to heal, to capture an objective, whatever, that sort of thing. And making sure that your map is designed in a way that, guides that flow and kind of encourages it, is huge. We're going to talk about kind of like 3 different kinds of map flow here on the next slide. But yeah, just points of interest. I pretty much already covered all that. We're going to move on. Map flow and player guidance. So part 2 of this. Game design will heavily influence the play spaces that you'll want to create and the kind of flow that you'll want to go for. Or sometimes it just happens by happenstance and these things, exist. Circular flow Halo maps are very good at this. Lockout is a great example of circular flow. Lane-centric flow is the other one. I guess I should touch on circular flow a little bit. That is, let me actually, now we're going to cut over to Photoshop. Let me find it because I have way too many things open. This is not that. We'll use, I know I said lockout, but we'll use Guardian in this quick example. And that is basically just the idea that the map flows in circles. Doesn't necessarily mean that the whole map is a circle, although I would argue that there is oh my gosh, that is the zoom, not my brush. Let's actually get the brush out. This kind of circular path, you guys can tell I'm a really good artist with a mouse. This kind of circular path, but even within that, there's circular paths.
And actually, when you're designing cover for a cover shooter or a single player or whatever for combat, you will create circular patterns of cover as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. So basically, it just means that at any point, the player can move and flow in on themselves or into another area of flow. This basically means that no matter where they're going, as long as they don't run into a wall, they're going to fold back in somewhere to another path that then continues flow. You're not having dead ends. You're not having barriers or things like that. Everything, as long as you're moving in the direction of the map, again, not running into a wall, you will flow around your map. That is typically what is considered circular flow. We'll go back.
And this type of design gives players options. There's always a way out. They're not cornered.
Absolutely.
Because if you get cornered by enemies, that creates frustration. And the last thing you want as a designer for players to put your game down. Unless you work at FromSoft, then, maybe that's a measure of success.
Yeah. Lane-centric flow. This is very common in games like Call of Duty, Counter-Strike. We're going to use the example here. And there's a specific reason why I use that example we'll touch on here in just a second.
Because Dust is a fantastic map.
Dust is a fantastic map. And that's lane-centric. So let's go back to Photoshop, for example. Go to Dust. And basically, I mean, you can kind of already see it. You have lanes. These are not really, like, there is circular flow elements here, but primarily these are lanes. Like, there are dead ends. This is a dead end. This is a dead end. This is a dead end. This is a dead. I could keep going. There are dead ends there, and it's more focused on the lane that you're attacking through and not so much about flowing specifically around the map and never stopping. This is really good for competitive kinds of maps because it gives you a lot of control. Like, if
Valorant
you're here,
doesn't a lot.
Yeah, Valorant.
And then the other one that I was thinking, keep talking, Dan, I'll remember.
No, you're good. You're good. It really helps for map control, and it really also helps with map knowledge because you only have to know a certain number of lanes to know, okay, I'm here, Tommy's over there, and he says it's empty, so then everybody else must be in lane C or whatever. It's really good for map knowledge control, team-based things, very competitive. That kind of lane base is very good for that.
I don't know why I forgot it. Fortnite Ballistic.
Yes,
the map that we released for Ballistic uses this design to very high degree.
Absolutely. Yep. And then the last one is push-pull flow. This is very normally objective-based. Also is very common in single-player games like Doom, as an example. You start, you push into the enemy territory. There's a front line. Front lines are very common in push-pull flows. Really good for objective modes, things like that. You could look at a battlefield map and be like, all right, cool, here's some circular flow aspects in here, and here's some lanes or whatever. But in general, the whole point is that kind of front line pushing and pulling back and forth.
Also, Last of Us, believe it or not, uses that quite a bit.
Yep, absolutely. So one of the last things we're going to touch on here on the slides, and we'll jump in, is this is sometimes considered contentious. I do have
one more thing to say about the last slide before we get to this last one.
Please.
One other method that you see a lot is hourglass design.
Yes.
The idea of a wide space then comes down to a narrow space that opens up into another wide space. It's a method of flow control in single player, but also works well in multiplayer because it controls both. It gives the opportunity to control the large spaces and use the smaller spaces as a point of contention. But also in single player, those smaller areas can give you a chance to relax or not. Dead Space does this. I think Dead Space 2 in particular does this very well. The claustrophobic spaces, you'll have that, and then it'll open into a wider space, but you look around and you know you are about to get jumped by a dozen monsters.
Yeah. The other side of that coin is the opposite, which is the diamond shape, which is that you start from a point and then you have options. It spreads out. You can go. So I kind of have this like loosely drawn here. You can start here. You can either go straight. You can take the left path. You can take a right path. You can have all these engagements that happen here and then eventually funnel yourself back down to a single point there. So our shape and then the opposite, which is this diamond.
It's also a way to give players the illusion of choice.
Yes.
While still making them move to the point that as the designer, you want them to.
Exactly. And that goes back to make them feel like they have agency. They might not always, but they feel like they do. Cool.
So again, this fake player agency.
Yes.
And we do it all the time.
Yes. You'd be surprised how often it happens to you, even when you don't realize it. But this one is more of just like a general philosophy for designing maps, and that is the jack of all trades, master of none. There are exceptions to this. There are some maps that are amazing in objective game modes and free for all and this, and they have that perfect balance of all the elements to make them very good at multiple things. But those are the exception to the rule. And I would especially argue that if you're new to level design, it can be very overwhelming to try to design to match every single possible game mode and outcome and play style. So
I would say don't.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Narrowing that focus does a couple of things. First off, there are just certain design philosophies that just are contradictory. They just don't work together. If you try to push on one, you're pulling from the other. It also takes a lot of time to develop for any specific individual thing. And if you try to put every single thing in there, you're going to spend a lot of time on it. You're going to spend a lot of time fighting yourself. And in most cases, it's going to be a worse end product. I use this analogy. It's probably not great, but a fork is a wonderful tool. A spoon is a very different tool, and it is also wonderful. A spork is fine. It does the job of both, but not as good as either of the bespoke things do. So really think about what you're designing for. Give it a little bit. So like for example, we'll use Halo as one, is they make sure that their maps will work in any mode, but they design for specific modes. Zanzibar was designed as a one-sided objective map. That was the point of it. Whether it was single bomb assault, one flag CTF, it doesn't matter. The point is you have people outside, you have the people in the base, they're supposed to come in, do the thing, you're supposed to stop them. That's what it was designed for. That map was not designed to be a free-for-all map. It can play free-for-all, and some people enjoy that, and I actually think it can be fun, but it was not designed as a free-for-all map. And therefore, it is really good as a single-sided, objective-based map. So just make sure you know what your goal is and cater to it. Again, you can still support and consider other game modes and options and things like that. So you don't want to make it so it's like, well, if I tried to play this game mode on it, it just doesn't work and it crashes or whatever. Support it, but focus your design. Pick a direction and aim for that because it'll give you more time to devote to that to make sure that it's really good, and it won't be pushing and pulling between contradictory design philosophies. Wow. It's just, in my opinion, that's a better way of tackling a map. Cool. We're almost done. speed run through this because I keep saying that and we're not. Rule of threes is a very common thing in game design. Tina has mentioned it a couple times on a few of the other psychology of environment art things that we've done before. Players need to be able to make decisions essentially without thinking about it. Their brain is operating and they're making decisions, but they're not like sitting there being like, oh my God, which one do I specifically do? They're reacting to the environment, to the players, to the enemies, to the scenario, and then they're making those decisions mostly subconsciously. If you throw too much at them, that they can no longer make those decisions subconsciously, and they're going to have to start really focusing and breaking it down. Oh, this, blah, blah, blah. It can very easily overwhelm them. Give them too few options, though, then they have no agency. It's just, oh, I go left or I go right. Or in some cases, I only can go straight. And that's not very interesting. So a range of 2 to 5 is pretty typical. There are examples where that goes higher. There are examples where only one option makes sense. Like I have to open the big door, so I have to press the button to open big door. Exceptions exist. But in general, it's a good philosophy to give them options, but not overwhelm them. This goes to tie into the level design part of this with the dreaded 3-lane map. This has garnered some ire under certain communities, which I get and I totally understand. But I want to kind of come to the defense of the 3-lane map, because I don't personally believe that the idea of a 3-lane map is bad. I don't think that you inherently have a bad map if you have 3 lanes. I would actually argue, and we're going to use Dust because it is so dang good, as a great example of a wonderful 3-lane map. So we're going to go back to Photoshop for just a second.
Great use of space, verticality, hourglass design, actually.
So there's a little bit of variety here because these lanes kind of tie in or whatever. There's 3 lanes this way. There's 3 lanes that way. It is a 3-lane map. It's fantastic. Another example, Crash. Maybe not as good of a map. Definitely not as good of a map, but a very fun Call of Duty map. If I could actually draw better, this would be more convincing. 3 lanes. 3 lanes. We'll go back to, oh no, I drew on the wrong thing here. We'll go back
that's
to,
what you get for not naming your layers.
Yep. Go back to Guardian. 3 lanes. 3 lanes. They're great maps. They're absolutely amazing. The issue isn't that it's a 3-lane map. The issue is that it is a bad 3-lane map. So keep that in mind, because I know some designers are like, I refuse to design 3-lane maps. And I'm just like, why though? Because they have a time and place. I'm not saying at all that every map should be 3 lanes and you should never deviate from this and this is doctrine. Absolutely not. There are also plenty of amazing maps that are not 3 lanes. But
I think some of the most... sorry.
No.
I think some of the most fantastically designed multiplayer maps are maps that are not 3-lane and mirrored of each other.
Sure.
But they're very difficult to create.
Yes.
And, one of the things that we haven't really touched on is games are all built under time constraints. You'd love to be able to sit there and iterate on something and play test it for hours. But there's budgets and time is money. And, as all gamers understand, companies like to promise when something is going to be out. So you only have X amount of time to design something. And there is nothing wrong with using tried and true methods because players expect those and
Sure.
they know how to react to them.
Yeah, and that's kind of the point that I want to emphasize. So I'm glad you said that. Is like this does not mean you must do 3-lane map, right? Like there are times and places for all of it. One of the nice things about a 3-lane map, though, specifically with competitive, is again we're going back to that rule of 3s. It's giving them enough variety and options that they have agency and they can make choices. but they don't have to be like, oh man, wait, how many? So there's this path, there's that path, there's this path, there's that path, there's 7 lanes here. We only have 4 guys, so if there's 3 that are always unattended, and I don't even know where that lane goes or ties into it. It's very good for competitive style maps to have a known quantity that's manageable. 3 to 4 is usually pretty good at that. One of the things that I like about specifically Dust, and why I think it is a really great 3-lane map, is that it is 3 lanes, but they also play around with it. This is not just a straight line lane. It kind of hooks around and has some interesting. It's still 1 lane, but they play with it and they give some variety. So it's not just like left side, center side, right side, and then that's it. Still 3-lane, but they played with it and they made a very interesting sort of thing. So this is really kind of more of like a little bit of a tangent thing, but I just wanted to express that because I know there are some designers that say, I refuse to do that. And it's just like, well, that's like saying I refuse to stitch somebody. Sometimes people need stitches, right? Like there's a time and place for this sort of thing. And I just wanted to touch on that. Cool. With that, we can finally jump into the editor. Yay! Yeah. I know we got about 30 minutes or so here. Actually, wanted to just quickly say, if Jessica, you need to go, Tina, are we cool to just like have her hold a cool pose and then go a little bit longer if we need to, if we don't get through this all?
Yeah, that's fine on mine.
We should be able to get through it, but just wanted to Jessica's that cool with you?
Hey, as long as no one kicks me out of where I am,
okay.
I can stay until whenever.
Perfect. So let's go ahead and jump in. So I brought a few examples of just some things that I wanted to show to demonstrate here. And actually one of them I'm going to go to right now because Jessica kind of already mentioned it, and it's a great little segue. And that is, I made a very, very simple character blueprint where I can go from first person to third person, whatever. And what I want to emphasize is that scale is very important, and it varies for what the needs. Again, we talked about first person to third person, but there's also a very interesting thing about video games where, because everything is compressed to a single lens and you don't have dual perception to like truly see depth there. The other side of it too is your peripheral vision goes way above you and way below you and to the sides, but your screen is this, right? So to try to match that perspective causes a lot of compression. And the reason I wanted to bring that up is that is quite a large door by door standards. I went through and got measurements for what the typical door ranges are, and I picked the largest size. That door looks small. That looks like a small door. But you walk up into it, that's pretty normal for a door frame on a person. If you stand in your doorway right now and look up, that's probably taller than yours is. But it doesn't feel like that in this 3D space. It feels like a small door. So you want to be
in a third person perspective, it wouldn't really accommodate the camera well.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So a lot of times, especially in third person games, is you'll do like a 1.5x style door. Now this looks kind of big, but in third person, a little tall. But what it allows is it allows for your camera and your player to move through this door without too much clipping. Now there's a bit, and my camera does not have any collision awareness, so it's just going to kind of clip through there. But this feels better in a third person perspective than this does, because your camera is going to get stuck on it all the dang time and it's just not going to feel very good. So this again goes back to understanding what you're designing for. If it's first person, you can go to more closer to real life values. And I would actually argue where you want to have the closest to real life is in a VR game. So I kind of think of it in like a spectrum where your first person is kind of going to be like 1.2x scale in most cases for what real life is. Your VR, you want to get pretty much exactly. And then third person, you want to go way, way larger. The other thing that's also interesting that you might not be aware of is gamers are very used to the rules being kind of bent in video games. Specifically, one of the fun ones is gravity and jump. What is a fun jump height in a video game is ridiculous. to a human, like a real human. And if you tried to make the norm, like a typical person's jump height in a video game, you'd feel like you're just doing this.
It would be useless.
Yeah, you'd feel like you did basically nothing. The other one that's interesting is gravity. Usually about 1.7x the amount of gravity in a video game that would be real gravity. If you do, and we can even actually do this just for the sake of demonstration here. If I go into my blueprint, this is on a separate monitor. I promise I'm doing it. Where is
increasing that gravity while Dan is looking for it?
Yes.
Provides weight. It makes you feel like you're actually doing things. Pun not intended, but there you go. Gravity weight.
Yeah.
There's the finger guns again. It just
The
happens.
classics. They had to
The
come
classics. Yeah, it's Mario is an excellent example of this.
Yes.
Mario feels like even in the 2D versions of the games that it has weight, and they do that by sort of tweaking the gravity settings. When you really go like half gravity is when you really get this like floaty value, which Dan kind of has right there.
Yeah, so this is standard Earth gravity for this.
It does not feel real.
It feels real floaty. But this is how gravity actually works in the real world, but it doesn't work in the video game. So the point that we're trying to stress here with the scale and this is that design for what feels good. Don't design for what is objectively realistic, right? As long as it's believable and it feels right, you nailed it. Like that's
the way I had it explained to me, and the way I've always explained it to my students back in the day was fun and realism are on a spectrum.
Yes.
One end is completely unrealistic, but can be crazy fun. Think of things like Human Fall Flat, or that one game where you're bread and you want to be toast. These tend to be physics-based games. Oh yeah, no, that's a real game, Tina. Yeah, people make games about everything these days. And on the other side of that is super realistic things like Microsoft Flight Sim and Arma 3 is an excellent example of like it's more of a sim. What is the game that I used to play? Elite Dangerous. I actually used to play that in VR as well. It is very realistic. And, you know, if you think about on the spectrum for shooters, Call of Duty is like kind of dead center, right?
Yep.
It feels realistic. The guns are based on realistic things, but in real life, you don't get shot and then slowly heal, you know? But that's an element of design that is added to keep things fun.
Yeah. Yeah. It is exaggerated realism, right? It tries to keep itself grounded without being restricted and boring.
Don't let realism keep you from having fun.
Yes. Yep. Exactly. So the stuff that I'm going to be demoing here in Engine is really just kind of like a hodgepodge of tips and ideas and just things to keep in mind. One of the things that I see happen a lot, especially in early designs, I've said this before on previous shows, but I should restate it here. I was a course director for like 5 years, so I worked with a lot of students on making environments and things like that. And a very common thing that I would see is they'd be like, okay, I need to make a stairwell or whatever. So they would just grab the same basic stair and put it there. And that's cool. Kind of boring, especially if every single stairs is the exact same stairs of the exact same angle and whatever. You have the option as a designer and as an artist to exaggerate and play with shapes. So a quick example that I'll use here, I made a macro on my mouse so that I didn't have to right click, and I still do it because I did it forever, is like, okay, cool, I want a ramp to get up to this area. Cool, got a ramp, I got up to the area. That's fine. Not the most interesting thing in the world. So when you're playing around with your maps, don't be afraid to try some other things. Maybe the ramp is a little bit longer. So not only does it take a little bit longer for you to actually navigate it, but it also changes the space and fills up a little bit more of the space. And now, you know, you have just a different way to tackle this specific area. Maybe you go real long with it. Maybe it's a real long ramp. So you really have to take your time to get up to it. So I've committed basically Like my decision now is like, I've committed that I'm going to be on this ramp for a few seconds versus I'm going to be on this ramp for 1 or 2. Making those decisions controls flow and controls the player's decision, where this might have been a very easy choice and this one's a little riskier. Or it just gives a different flavor for the kind of area you're doing. Or maybe you do a little ramp to a flat part or another ramp. Maybe you do that same thing, but it's quite a longer flat part. So you have to commit to it a little bit longer. Maybe you find a middle ground where the ramp part is actually much longer, but the platform is short. And you go up there. These all serve the same purpose. It is a ramp to get up to an area, but each one of these has a different flavor and a different design consideration and a different consideration the player has to make when traversing it. It helps keep traversal interesting. We're going to touch on that a couple times as we go through here.
Can I add one more example,
please.
Dan?
Please.
The ramp doesn't even have to be a ramp. You can use a blocking volume that is the shape of a ramp and have the actual mesh be a pile of rubble, a car, broken stairs.
Absolutely.
The one I've often seen are like plates of metal that have fallen off a structure that create a ramp.
Yeah. Well, we're going to touch on one other one real quick here. It's over, Anakin. I have the high ground. We're gonna touch on that for a second because that is something very important actually for design, especially in my specific instance. You guys ready for my really good gun and bullets?
Verticality is such a wonderful, important part of level design.
It is.
I'm not sure it always has to start with a Star Wars joke, but it works.
It's specific to this reference or this example that I'm going to use because especially in like we're using a shooter as an example. I think I broke Tina. I'm sorry, Tina. Your camera
memes have their place in every slide deck. Always.
You have to have at least one. It's obligatory.
Just took me by surprise, really.
Somebody didn't do their homework last night.
Yeah. You outed yourself, Tina.
Oh my God.
In a shooter with humanoid people, which is most of them, camera is going to be towards the top of the head, and then you have a lot of the mass of the target below that camera, right? Now, traditionally, or at least in a lot of examples, when you fire your weapon, it's going to come out of the center of the camera and not necessarily out of the gun. There are ways around that, and I would actually say more games now are actually taking that route where they are dropping that projectile down. But either way, if you bring it up to your head, you're still making the area that the player can attack from being this little small section. So you could, in theory, hide the rest of your body and be able to attack while having very little risk of being attacked back. People call this head glitching, whatever. It's not really a glitch, just kind of a design issue. But that is really what people are taking advantage of when they say, I have the high ground, right? Because what it allows them to do is we'll use this character as an example. If I play down here, that character could shoot me. And I am completely visible because if I were to take the place of that character, you are completely visible. So you have now made it so that one character is a teeny tiny target and the other character is a much larger target, even though they are equidistant from each other. This isn't necessarily a problem. There's a lot of reasons to design high ground areas for power positions and ways to control map. But it is something that you have to consider because it will give the player over here, sorry, Tina, it will give the player over here an extreme advantage over the person down there. Again, fine when deliberate, but if you're having unintended examples of this, where it's starting to break map flow and map balance, and everybody is just trying to go to this one point of the map, then you need to find ways of remedying that by either making more flanking routes, giving other options for longer, other areas where they can also get to a higher level to counter them. that sort of thing. It's just another one of those things you have to consider when you're designing your level, specifically with this game mode in mind. High ground advantage doesn't exist in a platform, other than the fact that I guess if you jump on top of somebody, you could attack them. If that's an attack vector, then sure, it would. But like these sorts of things are very dependent to the game mode, the game style, the perspective, blah, 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 blah. So just something to keep in mind. Again, this is great. It's awesome to have power positions of high ground, but just understand what you're doing and what kind of power that gives them, and make sure that you're balancing and building your map around that, so that way there's not just the one overpowered position, which can happen in quite a few games.
I was going to say, this is not a reason to not put high ground in your maps.
Absolutely.
Flat maps are boring.
Yes.
Whether you're making single player, and I would argue it's actually more important in single player where you want the player to feel powerful. Play with your heights, you know, just as Dan says, be aware of what the height advantage or height disadvantage gives you. And for example, one thing you can add to Dan's example there with the two players sitting at different heights is if you give the character on the lower level a wall or something that is an appropriate height, you can nullify that advantage and balance it more.
Absolutely, which we will show off here. So I'm glad you brought that up. And I'm also glad you brought up the verticality, because I'm going to touch on that here in one of these future things.
I'm in your head, Dan.
You are. No, you're nailing it. You're nailing it. Jessica did have access to the slides, but she had no access to any of this stuff. So that's just intuition. She's nailing it. This is actually a good example of the head glitch where, again, in theory, that character could shoot me. But the only spot I can literally hit is that one part in their head. Quick example of what that would look like from the other person's perspective. So when you're designing a map, I actually put this asymmetrical for a reason, because if you have Team A spawns that side, Team B spawns this side, but you design a map where Team B gets this piece of cover pretty close to where they are, Team B has an inherent advantage over Team A in this instance, because this player can come out of this room and immediately be in cover, whereas this player comes out of the room and the only option they have is either hopefully outgun the player, die, or return from where they came. And those are the only options there. So this is, again,
I'm either going to fight from that doorway or just straight up like zigzag rush.
yeah, exactly. Hope they can do it. So again, it's not necessarily a problem to have high cover outside of a doorway, but understand what that does to the flow of your map and what that does for people on the receiving end of there. Have those considerations. This is why playtesting is huge, because you could place it there and be like, oh, you know what, this is too wide open. I want a piece of cover. I'm going to put it there. Move on with your life. Get to art and then realize, oh, crap, one side has a huge advantage in this area, so nobody's ever going to go to this part of the map because I didn't play test where I put my cover and never noticed that there was an issue there. Cool. We are going to jump over here real quick. Anybody who saw the thumbnail for this talk will recognize here a part here in a second. So this is just another example, kind of like the ramp we were talking about, where you can very easily say, hey, I'm on the ground. There's a part up here that I want the players to be able to get to. So therefore, make ramp. That serves its purpose. Functionally, it's doing exactly what it should. Kind of boring, not very interesting, and not very dynamic. But you can still accomplish this exact same goal while implementing a little bit of variety. So all I did here over the course of this literally took me maybe 10 minutes is I made like 4 or 5 variants and just tried some stuff out to see what stuck. So this is your default. We got a platform, ramp up to the platform, kind of a U. One of the options here is to split the platform. So now there's 2 different ways of tackling this. And then you could put something like a box to provide a little bit of cover if you need it. Not saying that this is the best choice, but it's something to try. See if it works. Here's another option. This could be a ramp. And then here you could actually have stairs that lead to a platform that lead up to another set of stairs. And then there's maybe a little railing there as cover. Now, all of a sudden, what was very simple and boring, your player has two different options for how they engage, and also cover that they can take when engaging somebody at the top, or if somebody is at the top engaging down, because you also have cover here as the person at the top. We'll go down here. Yeah, so it's just 4. This is also a very interesting way of doing it. This is a ramp that takes you up to the second place, but what we've done is we've narrowed it, we've added a bend, and we've added a large platform with some cover there. So now there's actually plenty more options the player at the bottom has for pushing up. They can hold this position, suppress them, push up the center, come up this way, or they could shift over here and try to draw them this way, or they could jump up and attack from here. This is the exact same setup. It is ramp up to platform, but the designs are very different, and they serve different purposes, and they add interest in terms of mechanics, but also traversal. It is much more interesting to come up to the top of this platform than it was the first one, which was just a simple ramp. So play around with different design ideas. This is like that's all I did, is I knew I wanted a ramp up to a platform, and I just jotted 4 of them out real quick. I probably could have done a couple dozen of these and come up with a bunch of other ones, but this was just a quick 10-minute thought exercise just to come up with a few different options here. And I ultimately decided I liked this one the most.
Yeah, I do as well. It gives you the most options. I, for one, would have also leaned on stairs on either of the side pieces.
Sure.
Or ladders, because then you're giving more of an advantage to the player on the lower platform to get up to the higher platform.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. There's multiple options here. And again, you wouldn't know that. Like if you just said, oh, I need a platform, made a platform, cool. You did your job objectively, but subjectively, it's not very interesting or fun. Okay, cool. We are going to do another quick little example here. So this is similar to what we just demonstrated there, which is like, I have a start position that I want to get, that I'm at, and I have an end position that I want to get to, right? Easiest way to do that, again, for you physics folks out there, is the path of least action, which is just this ramp. It's also very apt because this is also the least action. Nothing is happening. I am walking, and I'm walking, and I'm walking. Cool, I did it, right? Like I have objectively done the goal, but it wasn't interesting at all. The traversal was boring. yeah. We're seeing a lot of ramps. It was boring. It wasn't interesting. I would never play this map. Map is terrible. But you can still do the same goal just by adding a little bit of variety for how you want to tackle it. So this is the exact same area. These are in the exact same positions, but all I've done is given a little path of platforming that you have to do to get there. It's not the most in-depth, crazy thing you ever saw. I'm not like, whoa, now this is pod racing. Had to do it because of Tina. But it is a more interesting way of getting to this end goal. I've made traversal fun. This has become a challenge to get to this position. And it's also telling a little bit of story, right? Like this is kind of a building, you're jumping through it. This window fell out and broke, and then you're using it to go over. Maybe this is like a piece of wood that you can walk over to get to this other building, facade or whatever. Again, this was built in 15 minutes. Took me no time at all, and I was able to ideate and iterate on it very quickly and come up with something that's fairly interesting. I'm not saying ship it, right? But I'm just showing you as an example of how you can play with, here's point A, here's point B. Let's make getting from point A to point B interesting.
Yep. Environmental storytelling is so important.
Absolutely. Okay, cool. I probably won't get to this. This is also very incomplete, so we're going to kind of avoid that. But the last thing that I really wanted to talk about here was verticality and having interest in verticality. So it's very easy, especially if you do like I do very often, where I will have a piece of graph paper and I will just jot down, map designs from there. When you're looking at it from a 2D plane, you have your X and you have your Z, right? Or we'll use X and Y for Unreal's sake because Z is up. There's no depth there. You can design it knowing like, hey, this is going to be a ramp that goes up or whatever, but it's very easy to design on a 2D plane. And as Jessica said, that's very boring because it's not very interesting.
Boring.
You are limiting the amount of decisions that the player has to make. They only have to make the decision, do I look left or do I look right? That's all they have to do. You start adding that z-axis, and now they have to look, do I have to look up? Do I have to look down? Do I have to look up left? Do I have to look down left? Do I have to look up right? Do I have to look down right? That adds a whole new layer of design opportunity to make things interesting and fun and unique and not just a flat box with some cover in it. So I made a very brief thing. Again, this was done over the course of a weekend. I did this in like probably 4 hours, 3 or 4 hours, this whole thing I'm about to show you here, just to show how you can kind of start from a very simple thing. We're using a similar language as we had there. We have a blue spot, blue team spawn, red team spawn, they're in a little box, right? Again, if you played this would be terrible because you both would just spawn and everybody would just shoot each other and kill each other while they're spawning and nothing interesting happening here. So the first thing you do is put in a little bit of cover, right? So now when I spawn, I can't see the enemy team. They can't see me. We have to push out and engage. We have a couple different options here. Cool. Still pretty dang boring, but we're getting somewhere. We're starting to solve that problem. So the big issue is that even though they can't see me directly when I spawn, I can still see into their spawn and attack into the spawn and throw my amazing, oh, I broke it.
And that illustrates a good rule of thumb too, is that now it shoots red balls. Interesting.
No, I see, these are my very epic grenades, by the way.
One of the things that this map does is it allows you to shoot directly into the spawn, as Dan said. One of the rules of thumb that if you're making a multiplayer map is you want to make sure that you cannot do that. Spawns
Absolutely.
need to be either completely occluded, so you really have to work, which makes it more defensible for the defending team, or you just need to make them like completely enclosed.
Yep, exactly. So one of the things that I did to, again, try to help solve that is I now just put in a blocking element between those. So now we can spawn, we're still in cover. Even when we push out, we're not able to shoot directly into spawn, but we now have an area of kind of pushing up where they can push up, a little bit of cover. Again, we are working with basic shapes right now. It's just cubes. Nothing interesting is happening here, but we're starting to develop a bit of a play space. So we're going to keep working on this. So then the next thing I did is like, okay, cool. Let's add some verticality here, right? And that doesn't have to be extreme. In this case, it's quite subtle. It's just kind of like a little bit of a divot. But what this provides is it provides, as I am coming out of my spawn and I am pushing into their spawn, I have now given them a height advantage, which gives them a little bit more to defend with, right? This is very subtle. I increase it actually a little bit later, but it is not only giving interest in terms of traversal, but it's also playing into the mechanics where they're getting a little bit of a height advantage, and it helps them to push against any attacker. Again, though, we're still dealing with kind of pretty boring. It's like, okay, cool, we have a little bit of ramp, that's cool. We got a cover, we got a couple things here, but this left side, basically nothing of interest is happening here. So let's add a little interest to the left side here. So this part stayed largely the same, but now we have this alternate path where we get a little bit of a high ground. Okay, we're starting to get somewhere with this. I'm not saying it's like the best map you ever saw in life, but it's starting to become interesting. By adding these height variations, we're getting, this kind of a position of power where while if somebody was pushing down this way, they don't have the high ground or high advantage there, but they could have a friend up here, I can make the jump, that's covering them and laying down some suppressive fire or whatever. So we're starting to add some interest in how we engage. Instead of just, I spawn, I go over there, I shoot you. Now we have, okay, I'm going to push in the middle. Todd, you go up right and provide covering fire. We're starting to build in these layers of variation and interest in terms of traversal and game mechanics.
Is there something I can add in there super quickly too?
Yes.
Not even just from a multiplayer perspective, but also from the single player as well. Yeah, from single player, pathing like that is very easy for AI to pick up as well. So if you have a single player experience where maybe you have a team or something like that, it's very easy for them to be able to follow those kinds of pathings and be able to give supportive fire to your actual player as well.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, again, I'm using these a lot in like a multiplayer context, but they absolutely apply pretty universally, just maybe in a slightly different implementation, depending on whether it's a single player or even, again, doesn't even necessarily need to be a shooter. This could apply to other things as well. I'm gonna take some water real quick. Sorry.
No,
Oh,
this
I've been
applies
talking so
very
much.
well.
I'm talking so much.
This applies very well to if you're familiar with Fat Shark is the developer of the Darktide and Vermintide games. You know, Vermintide is almost essentially a wave or a horde-based melee game with some guns in it, where Darktide is actually that same formula, only the melee is now less emphasized and guns are more emphasized.
Yep.
They have some great blog posts about how they had to build Verticality that are absolutely worth your read if you're interested in the subject, because that game has some massive verticality built into it based on the setting.
Yep. Yep. So again, we made this little ramp platform there. I like it. It's cool. Like, it's good. We're starting to get somewhere, but we have nothing happening in this area. Not very interesting. So let's continue to build some stuff out. So now maybe instead that ramp starts in this area. We've added another piece of cover here, a little ramp there. This actually ends up going even higher now. So now we have quite a stark contrast in height here, but it also kind of narrows your view. So you could, in theory, shoot into their spawn here currently. So we'll want to address that. But we're starting to, again, add more layers in terms of our height, in terms of our variation there. We're adding a little bit more cover. We're adding some interesting landmarks. This has kind of now become a little bit of a point of interest over here versus what it was before. If you push into here, the players have more options for defending themselves or coming up around to make some kind of flanking maneuvers if somebody's pushing into their objective. We're just starting to build out these places and make them a little bit more interesting.
And now you've made that space more interesting for team deathmatch and capture the flag, because you had a little spot there that would be perfect for a flag.
Yep, absolutely. So again, we're just going to kind of keep iterating on this. I decided to separate it so we have a path that ramps up over here, and then the ramp isn't uniform. It actually starts a little bit here. It's actually a sharper ramp and actually leads to a flat platform here. So down here, it's just ramp to top. Over here, it's ramp to platform, which provides variety and interesting engagements. I've started to angle this area here, because when you did it over here, it's just this straight line, not very interesting. There's not a lot of cover at the top here. You're pretty exposed. Adding something simple like a little bit of an angle to this now starts to provide a little bit of cover for you here and just breaks up the straight lines, makes things a little bit more visually interesting. Add a little platform here. And then in the center, we're starting to work with a little bit of kind of some themes here. We got some of these like big columns. There's a couple big columns. That center thing has now kind of become a big column. We're kind of like unifying this a little bit in here. This is also a very symmetrical map. Did that on purpose. And then we move over to what I've lovingly referred to as the finished version of this, where all we've really done, again, is just kind of started adding some interesting angles. So instead of this being a flat wall, there's a little bit of angle here. These all have angles. I've actually increased the angle of this quite significantly to provide a little bit more cover. There's a little bit of a platform here now where you can kind of push out and attack. Platform over here. Now I've added some of these large structures to start occluding, so you can't just shoot into the enemy spawn from here, because you absolutely could before. And if you go up on here, again, you still have a slight area that you might want to address with being able to hit that spawn point directly, but added a little bit of cover, makes it a little bit harder. So it's really, they only have this position to make that attack, and they've exposed themselves quite significantly to try to get that angle, which could be a risk reward thing, right? Like, it is a small thing here. You could have a bit of an advantage there, but you are heavily exposing yourself to any sort of attack. Just made a little bit of center thing here. So there's actually cover once you get up here. It's symmetrical on the other side, so you don't really have to do too much there. And then, yeah, just kind of add it a little bit down here. Not the most interesting thing. You could definitely take this and go way further. I would say as far as an actual finished thing, I'm probably only like maybe 65-70% of the way there. But I wanted to at least show like how you could simply go like, hey, here's an A spawn, here's a B spawn. How can we build this out to make it an interesting combat environment? Cool.
I do like the design of that. One of the things that you're able to do with the rounded pieces is really make it feel a lot more interesting, because for the most part, in a lot of environments, you don't want to have these really boxy elements. You know, shape language, boxes are boring. Boxes are man-made. Boxes tell you that this thing has utility, but it doesn't really communicate anything other than that. Rounded elements give interest. They tend to communicate that this area might be safe. Whereas if you use like spiky elements, which, you know, I would add some spiky elements in this, you know, some triangles and things like that, you're communicating that an area is dangerous, or, you know, hey, I'm going to hurt you, kind of deal.
Yep. And one of the things that I did here just to keep things interesting is I very heavily avoided any like perfect 90-degree angles. None of these are perfect 90s. They're a little bit obtuse to kind of draw a little bit of interest and kind of force direction. So that way, again, it's not huge. We're not talking like really crazy angles, but just enough to kind of keep things from feeling super mechanical, super boxy, which is boring, right? Little things like that can go a long way. I don't know how much time you have, Jessica. I have one last thing if you're still here for it.
I want to try to stick around for some questions because I've seen some good questions in chat. So make it fast.
Yeah, it won't. This will be very quick. Cool.
Hell yeah.
Another quick example of I'm in room, enemies in room. I need to connect these two rooms. What are some interesting ways to do that? Most obvious one with least action is straight line. Not very interesting. And actually what it causes is if I'm pushing through here, let's say there was nobody there as I started to enter. If I got about halfway there and then somebody rounds that corner, unless I outgun them, I'm dead. Because there's nowhere I can go. I can't turn around and run back. It's too long. I can try to push into them, but they're probably getting the drop on me at that point. You've kind of forced them into this kind of kill box, like this death area. It's actually funny because Dust 2 has a little strip on the map that's pretty much the exact same thing, where it's just a long strip, and people call it like Death Alley. It's like if you're in there, you're dead. Like because you just can't get out. So a couple ways, again, play with the verticality, add a little bit of high ground. Now I have, you know, some variation there in terms of that. Interesting, maybe not enough. I don't think it's quite as much. You could start playing really with the angles. So now, even if there's somebody there, I have a way of taking cover or even having cover with things like pillars. Go over here, widening it out, adding a column in the center. Just another interesting option to kind of add some cover, affect sight lines, make traversal interesting where it's not just run down hall. Over here, this is not necessarily good design, but it is an option to kind of play with the height, play with the cover that you have in there, just to provide a little bit of options. Kind of boring, but it's an interesting idea. Maybe not the best execution. Kind of similar thing there. Just simply zigzagging this slightly causes a little bit more cover. It's not just a straight line. We're playing around with navigation there. Over here, this one gets quite crazy, but now we've added a long area, kind of like a balcony sort of situation. And still, I want to emphasize, these are the same rooms at the same distance. The only thing that's changed is how you're connecting them. And then another little option here. This one goes quite different, which is to create a very vertical platform that this other room is on. So that way, it's a little bit more interesting to traverse between these two areas. And this actually almost becomes its own point of interest in and of itself. And then the last one here is just kind of playing off of that hallway option, but adding a little bit of zigzag. So this one's getting there, but it's not great. One, because I can still see all the way through. Not very interesting. And that could be a problem area, especially with if you're like using this as a Call of Duty example. Somebody can just hard scope that with a sniper, take you out the second you're around the corner. Not very fun. So adding a little bit of a buffer zone helps solve that. So we're getting a little bit more interesting here. And then this last one, kind of combining a little bit of all these elements where you have a little bit of a buffer zone, you have this hallway that kind of zigzags through, and then adds a little bit of a vertical element. Now we've made go from one building or one room to another room via hallway much more interesting by just simply adding a little bit of maneuvering that has to happen in terms of the actual shape of the room, but also a little bit of verticality, things like that. Again, I'm not saying like this is the best hallway. You're gonna have if you're making a hallway, do this in your video game. But I want you to think like this. How can I make something as simple as connecting two rooms interesting and gameplay centric and just fun and like an interesting way of traversing, and make it an area that if combat happens, it's also compelling and interesting in that regard.
This also shows iterative design very, very well. Here I have this space. My art director comes back to me and says, this is boring, do something with it. Okay, so I add this and this. Well, I get more feedback, and like my director is like, where's the verticality? You know, we got to do something else with this. And you can do the same thing with the same space and make it better. You know, you'll never get it right the first time. No. Is I think the piece of advice I would pass on. People are going to give you critique. We could do a whole session on just getting and receiving critique.
And you should get it, and you should receive it.
Because that's what makes everything better. But this is just an excellent example of iterative design and how you can take critique and incorporate it into your design.
Yeah, and with the limitations that I had, this was the one that I think I liked the most, where I kind of opened up this area a little bit. So now it's kind of like a room between rooms, still have the verticality. Again, could be better, could be refined, but it is definitely significantly more interesting than straight hallway of death. Okay, I am going to stop talking now because I talk a lot. Let's.
No, this is great. Great examples.
I am here for the Q&A.
Yes, awesome. So there's a few. I'm going to try and order these a little bit. So Jessica, if you have to hop out at any point, just let us know. I'll try and tackle the ones I really want to make sure we get your insight on first. The first one here is kind of interesting because I know that a lot of this was from the perspective of, like you were saying, multiplayer or even like shooter games or stuff like that. But there was a really interesting question someone had of what kind of advice would you give for someone who is making levels for their game that doesn't have combat, but they want to still get that level of variety as well?
Well, spaces, even in a game like, Portal is an excellent example, right? Those spaces still need to be interesting. The traversal still needs to be interesting. So I think a lot of the rules that we talked about still apply. You need to have verticality, but you're essentially replacing combat with puzzles, you know? Think about what the tools and the gameplay aspects that the player has at their disposal, and think about ways you can use them to solve problems. You know, there are, in a lot of ways, times where you can take Dead Space as an example, take out all of the enemies and just made it, hey, this guy has to walk around a ruined ship and fix it. And it still would have been very interesting because you have things like he needs to get from point A to point B. Oh, this bridge is out. Oh, now I have to go around here, activate this console and come back. Or I have to find this tool that can and these materials that can allow me to build something that cross it. So you have to think a little bit more creatively, and there's, to be perfectly honest, only so many ways that puzzles can work in like first and third person games, like bring this thing from A to B, find this console or button, grab this thing and put it here, find an alternate route because of what this is broken. But it's up to you to add variety in that way. You know, bonus if you add something like a gravity gun or a telekinesis type of effect, where then now you can do box stacking puzzles or take advantage of physics to like throw something across to another area and then traverse to get over there separately. You just have to think of every place that you would put combat, put an interesting puzzle.
That's a great way of summarizing. Yeah, I the only thing I would add is I would say, I mean, it depends on what your mechanics are, then like what your game is. If you're not having combat, whatever that driving gameplay force is, like Jessica said, emphasize that. And I would also argue that level design almost becomes more important there because you're not relying on other aspects to kind of make up that slack, right? A arena could be fine, but be very fun with great combat or whatever. You remove that, now you just have a fine arena that's not that interesting. So whatever your mechanics are, lean into those heavily, like Jessica said, but also you might want to even pay. I mean, I would argue you should pay the most attention to your level design no matter what, but especially in that instance, make sure that your level design is up to snuff and providing variety and interest, because you don't have as many other options to rely on to kind of pick up that slack.
Definitely.
Yeah. Absolutely. If there's one thing that I'll add on to all that too, and it's also taking a little bit of advice from chat as well, because someone mentioned using real life places as inspiration also helps. And I want to piggyback off of that because that's absolutely true. And specifically, I would try and find examples of buildings or spaces in the real world that are specifically designed to move people through them. So a great example would be museums. Walking museums. They're specifically designed in a way that is supposed to pique your interest and have you walk through the entire building and find every single display that they have for you in a way that is natural. So going through and finding places like that can also help with, especially if it's a slower paced game or something that doesn't have combat or something like that, pushing it forward.
Absolutely.
That is a great example.
Yep.
Next question I've got here for y'all. Someone's wondering, any tips on how to apply some of these design concepts to open worlds? Things like where to place POIs, resources, connections to other biomes, etc. What can I do with these empty spaces to make them seem less boring?
So what you want to do in that instance is, and I write about this in my guide, is think about things in terms of positive and negative space. Positive space is more enclosed space, solid things, that type of thing, and negative space. And when you do that, positive space tends to draw you in, while negative space tends to like make you want to flow through it. Use that to your advantage. Put your POIs in places where you want the player to kind of move that direction, because they'll see it in the distance because of a lighting cue or a sound cue or something on your map, and you'll naturally move toward it. Use occlusion to your advantage, like trees or foliage or ruins, to be able to hide the areas a little bit that you don't want the player to go to, because they will be naturally inclined to kind of move away from that. Or if you're like me, it tends to make them more interesting. And I'm like, oh, there's something hiding over there. So put something hiding over there that you can get for exploring that, but then of course make them want to move to another area.
Yeah.
And sort of use that hourglass design method. Funnel the player using POIs or combat or environmental hazards or whatever your gameplay mechanics are to move players through large open spaces. If we think about things like Breath of the Wild is an excellent example. Nintendo loves to do this. They use triangles. If you and people are going to go back and play Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, and they're going to be like, "Oh my God, there's triangles all over the place." Nintendo is notorious for doing this. Triangles, if you put them in front of a player, tend to divert the player's direction either one way or the other, and divert their attention one way or the other. So you can use cues like lighting and sound, and sparkly treasure, to get them to go one way or the other. And if you want to put POIs at both ends of something, both ends of the triangle, put a mountain in the middle of your space. It's going to make the player automatically want to go one direction. It'll form a path out of an empty space.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah, the only thing I would add is also, again, play with that verticality, right? Like if you have a big open world and you have points of interest and places you want to get to, and you're like, well, I'm trying to think of ideas of way of breaking that up. Hills, cliffs, ravines, winding paths like that you sculpt into the environment now makes this long linear walk towards POI 1 to be like, oh, I'm navigating along this riverbed and there's all this, zigzagging patterns and things like that. Or I have to go up on this kind of cliff face and traverse around there. That verticality breaks up the space, helps with the positive and negative space, like Jessica said, and just gives you something interesting to do while traversing. So it's not just, run up ramp. Like I have a lovely example of.
So many ramps.
Yes.
Chad is giving some
Awesome.
excellent examples of other things like Disneyland, Disney World.
Mm-hmm.
They do it all the time. Apex Legends, really great at doing that as well.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. This next question I wanted to make sure I could ask both of you because I feel like, especially with backgrounds as educators and stuff, you would have an interesting viewpoint on this. But how important do you consider it to be for level designers to know many different types of tools and software?
The thing I would say about learning level design is don't worry about the tools and software. If you decide to join a studio, you can learn the software on the job. For example, Epic, on the documentation team, we have hired people who have zero engine knowledge but are fantastic writers. This is because you can learn those software skills entirely on the job. Think of it in terms of, too, is what if you go to work for a developer that uses a proprietary engine? There's no way you can have had practice with that ahead of time. So I wouldn't worry so much about the software skills. What you really want to learn as a level design is your fundamentals. And this is kind of funny coming from me as a teacher. When I was a student in my game development program, the level design class was not fundamentals based. It was software based. And that did not serve me very well because we would often talk about, and you see this sometimes online with teaching material, they'll talk about we're going to put this pillar here, and they won't tell you why. They won't talk about occlusion. They won't talk about funneling the player or anything like that. I didn't learn that until quite a bit later in my career. And it was suddenly like everything I learned from all of these magazines that I would read, like I'd read Game Developer Magazine, all these articles, all these things I learned from my professor, my level design professor, when I was in school many, many years ago. Suddenly all of that clicked, but I didn't have those foundational skills. So look for the things that teach you foundational skills, which is why I'm actually putting out the tutorial series I am now, because there's not a lot of material that really teaches that. Use real life experiences to help sort of inform your design. And believe it or not, learn some architecture. Architecture is about creating functional spaces that people want to use. How is that not a level? That's why, honestly, you hear a lot about level designers are like, oh yeah, I'm also really into architecture. I never took any architecture classes, but I am really into architecture.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
Awesome. I saw you nodding, Dan. I wasn't sure if you just agreed or.
I mean, that's largely true. Like you don't really need software to learn these. Like you could learn this with a pen and pad. You could learn this from
100%.
just deconstructing your favorite maps. I mean, a software I would recommend would be something like Unreal that has everything built in and it's free. And placing blocks to design levels, like you need basically no engine knowledge to do level design in Unreal. You need to know how to drag something out of the content browser and how to switch widgets. After that, you can start designing to your heart's content. So no, I don't really think it's necessary. Like, is there benefits to some things? Like, yeah, like why am I drawing a blank on that? It's world something where you can take topological data and bring it in as a starting point. World machine? So, yeah, thank you.
Yep.
Like those things are great and they can definitely aid with you and like in making these environments and things like that, but absolutely not necessary at all. I mean, honestly, I'd argue you could learn how to make levels with wooden toy blocks, right? Like that's is the same principle. You're just doing it in 3D space digitally on the in an engine.
Yeah, awesome. We do have a few more questions, but I wanted to make sure we're cognizant of your time, Jessica. Are you good to stick around, or do you
I'm
gotta
good to
pop
stick
off?
around probably 9 more minutes until 4:30, and then I really do have to go.
Perfect.
Rapid
Speed
fire.
run.
All
Speed
right, we
run.
got this.
Lightning round.
Yeah.
Let's go.
All right. So next question I've got for you is someone's curious, what are some good maps that you can think of for a fighting game genre? The games for like examples of games they're talking about is things like Guilty Gear, Tekken 8, that kind of stuff.
Ooh, you're asking the wrong person. I had a roommate once that was really big into fighting games. Um, but I think, again, a lot of these same things apply, right? If you're going to have Tekken is a great 3D fighter, you can move around in 3D space and circle each other, have things that are interesting, provide the player with opportunities to make decisions. If you're just fighting on a 2D plane like, you know, Mortal Kombat, there's really no options. It's more of a focus between how you're countering and how you're attacking the other person. But with something like Tekken or Virtua Fighter, if we want to go even further back in the day, put pillars in the level, put things you can break, um, maybe some things that you can pick up and use as a weapon. There's a lot of interesting ways I think you could make a 3D fighting space work really well. And verticality as well, right? You can jump on a platform. I mean, Smash Brothers does that really well. Actually, I think Smash Brothers applies very well to using a lot of different mechanics to create an interesting fighting arena.
Yeah, pretty much that. I mean, I'm also not terribly versed in fighting games, but I know at least something like Tekken and things like that, you're pretty locked. Like I know you can pivot and rotate around, but in games like that, normally, from what my understanding is, most of the time it's the level's more set dressing than anything. It's just kind of giving a place for the mechanics to take place on. I know that some fighters have gone a little bit more exploratory in that sense, where they've added verticality and ramps and things like that. You could do that, but yeah, I don't really have a whole lot of input on that one. It's just not my area of expertise.
Yeah. I feel like some fighting games are actually a great example of where doing too much in the level design actually detracts from the game experience. Because really, with fighting games, you want the combat to be the thing that's shining. It comes down to the strategy and the talent of the players and what they're doing against each other. And if the level around it is too cluttered or there's too much going on, then that might detract from the actual fighting itself. So sometimes that might be a great example of where less is more, honestly, to help enhance the experience.
Exactly. Yep. The level supports the gameplay by not having anything in it.
Yeah, definitely. Speaking of swapping genres, got another genre to throw at you. How can some of these concepts apply to Metroidvania kinds of games, where later upgrades make new areas or even movement options available for the player?
Well, that's all about making levels that support your gameplay, right? If we think back to the Metroid games, the game really changes for the first time when you get a missile or a bomb. It allows you to blow up piles of rocks that allow you to then enter different areas that you would not before. When you start talking about that, you start talking about games where you traverse the same area a lot of the time. Original Dead Space is really an excellent example of that. You go back. Actually, it's in that respect, it is kind of like a Metroidvania game. You go back to a lot of areas that you were in before because you have a new tool or a new ability that then opens up the next section of the level. You just have to remember to include that in your design. Design out the first section, where maybe the game is split into 3 acts, and in Act 1 you traverse this first part in the very beginning that's like a Z shape, and you want to then reuse that. Well, okay, give the player a reason to go back to their ship or go back to the beginning and get something, and then halfway down maybe the vertical portion of it, because verticality is very important in Metroidvania style games, put a breakable wall that is a breakable wall, or a door that requires a hacking tool, or there's a lot of different options that you can control flow. It's called lots of door and key options are called flow control, that then they can go in and it transitions you to a new part of the level. Metroidvania games, I think, are a great example of level design, because you really have to almost do what I learned initially, and what I like to do, which is called backwards design. You start with what the final idea is and where the player needs to be, and you work backwards from that. And then you have to think about it in terms of stages. Well, they can't move into this next part until that goes into Act 2 until they get the bomb. So, okay, now they got the bomb, they go back, they start opening up all these fissures and holes that lead to secrets and different parts of the level. And I would just say, to sum it up, I would just say Metroidvania games are like an excellent example of designing with supporting the gameplay.
Yeah. Metroidvania is also one of the, I would say, harder ones to design for, because you have to consider the player, like what the player can do when they have nothing, and then how each new addition affects the design, because a place that they couldn't get to without a double jump is now a place they can get to with a double jump, and that can affect the flow. Like if you made it where unlocking item 4 requires item 3, but item 2 lets you get to item 4 because the design had a bug or a flaw or if something was overlooked, then that breaks it. So you have to consider all of the iterations and permutations of what they have and what they unlock, and then make sure that it's interesting and that you're tapering out the progression well, so that way it's kind of like a slow trickle rather than just you have this thing and that's a whole complicated thing, which is really fun, but it's definitely challenging to do it very well and very interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
It's a hell of a design exercise. I got time for one more.
Let's do it.
Yes. Last question I have would be, okay, I technically have 2. This one is super quick, just because they want to make sure that I ask while you're here. But they want to see the dynamic trio of Tina, Dan, and Jessica making a small demo. Is the challenge accepted?
Okay, since I moved into people management, it's a bit of a challenge to find time for things, but I would be down. I love that idea. And you two are great to work with.
It's not off the table. I'll take it. All right, then the actual last question. Dan, your answer doesn't matter, apparently, since I'm so scooting right past it.
Only my answer matters.
Valid. No argument.
All right, Dan, yes or no? What do you think?
The previous question?
Yeah, yes or no?
Yeah, let's talk. Let's do it. Let's see. I'd be down.
Okay. All right, here we go.
Make it happen.
All right. Actual last question. What would be the best approach to designing games where you have to go back and forth between different areas a lot of times, while making sure that the player doesn't feel lost, but also that it doesn't get boring as time goes on?
I feel like that really goes back to the Metroidvania example, right? Because that's sort of a hallmark of Metroidvania games, is you traverse the same area over and over and over. I would say from my perspective and the games that I enjoy and the games that I like to design, do things that make the area update along with the story or the gameplay. I hate going back to Dead Space, but Dead Space, such an excellent example of this. You traverse an area, you go and you do something else. The thing that you did in Area B causes Area A to flood with gas. The area is also now filled with a deadly plant. If you set it on fire, it burns away the gas and it burns away the plant. So now you have to get to some tool that sparks a fire or causes an explosion or something like that. And it suddenly makes traversing the same area different. You know, you're still reusing the same geometry, and I've seen some people talking about reusing assets, and yes, reusing asset is a game designer's best friend, not just indies, because it saves time and it saves money. But and then to add this mechanic of like fire and gas and maybe deadly vines is like, you need a vine static mesh. You need to do a little bit of programming. Here's Niagara particles that make gas. It really allows you to not have to build a lot to reuse an area. Think about ways that you can make the area different and fun by adding a mechanic or make it feel like it changed. Another example might be something happens and now you're traversing the area, but the area is all wrecked. You swap out the static meshes for wrecked versions, but you leave all the blocking volumes and the collision the same, you know?
Yeah.
Or here's another example. Make it so that the whole thing is now frozen. So now all you need to do is get from one warm room to another warm room, and you're not even changing the geometry of the level. You're just adding maybe a volume in the hallways that hurts you, and a volume in the warm rooms that heals you.
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much echo that exactly. Or like the only thing I would add is like find ways to vary it up. So like maybe the first time you traverse through the area, if this is a combat game, it's empty, right? And then you go and you get a tool or a weapon or an upgrade or whatever, and then on your way back, maybe now there's a monster in there that adds a gameplay element to there. Or the other one that I would also encourage is alternate paths, right? Maybe you have to get back to, position A, but route B that you took is no longer available, and now you have to take route C, which ties back into, position A. Things like that, just to kind of to vary it up and make things interesting. If it's a horror game, maybe you walk through it the first time, the lights are on, you get a flashlight, and you come back and all the power's out. So now you have to navigate it with a flashlight and things like that. Like those little things can go a long way to keep it from just being like, oh yeah, I've been in this hallway 7 times, like, to keep it interesting.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. All great examples. Thank you so much.
Or as
Thank
chat
you both
says,
so much for
flood
doing
it.
this too. Yeah.
Just
Flood it,
fill it with
yes.
water.
Always. But yeah, thank you both so much for doing this, for taking the time to walk through this and these concepts. This was a really, really informative session. So I really can't thank you enough for taking the time and doing this.
Oh, you're welcome. This was so much fun.
Yeah.
And someone in chat saying, I hope there's a part 2.
Yeah, and if you want a part 2, as we kind of alluded here with Jessica's side of it, there's a whole bunch of depth just in the single player linear way of handling that. We could do a part 2 that's just completely about, all right, let's do this for a linear game. Let's start to finish, the concepts that you would want for something like that. So if you want a part 2, let us know. Twist Tina's arm.
Yep. Just yell at me and it'll happen. But yeah, thank you all so much for coming and watching the show as well, asking questions, being part of it. It wouldn't be what it is without you being here and hanging out with us. So thank you also for taking the time to be here. If you missed any part of the stream or you want to go back and rewatch something, don't worry, because we post all of our videos, our streams in video format. There we go. That can be viewed on demand on both our Twitch and YouTube channel at Unreal Engine. And you can also keep up with us at Unreal Engine on all of our socials to keep up with the latest news, all that kind of good stuff. And then, if you haven't already, please come join us on the EDC, which stands for the Epic Developer Community, where we have our forums. We also have our documentation for the engine. We have lots of learning content, tutorials from both Epic staff and the community. It's great. Pretty much everything you could ever need for the engine is all right there in that one space. So go check it out if you haven't already. We'd love to have you there. Last thing I want to make sure I call out for those of you who are actively using Unreal Engine, 5.5.4 just came out this past Tuesday. So check it out. Let us know what you think. Play around in it. Let us know if any bugs or anything comes up. Let us know in the forums. But yeah, play around with it. Let us know what you think. But that's everything. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming and hanging out. And we'll see y'all next time. Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
guys. Thank you.